The wind hit Myra Voss like a fist the moment she stepped off the iron transport. It did not welcome her. It did not warn her. It simply struck her across the face hard and flat and then kept moving like she was nothing more than a fence post in the ground. She stood at the edge of the frozen road and let the cold settle around her, and she breathed once, deliberately, the way she had been breathing deliberately for most of her 22 years. She had been given 3 things before she left: a coat that belonged to someone else, a pair of boots that were half a size too large, and a letter sealed with red wax that she was not permitted to open. She wore the coat, she walked in the boots. She had tucked the letter into her inner pocket 3 days ago on the transport and had not thought about it since. Whatever it said was for the pack, not for her. Offerings did not get to read their own terms. The landscape ahead of her was the same white and gray it had been for the last 2 days of travel, but different in quality. The way water in a glass was the same as water in the sea but was not the same at all. The trees at the far edge of the road stood motionless and dark against the pale sky, and the silence that came from them was not empty but full, pressed tight with something she could not yet identify, but that her body recognized before her mind did. Her shoulders went slightly tighter. Her breathing slowed further. She had learned not to fight the body when it knew something the mind had not caught up to yet. She started walking. Nobody had told her to walk toward the trees. Nobody had told her anything useful in the days before she left. The village council had gathered her at dawn in the meeting hall, which smelled of old wood and candle wax and the particular combination of formality and anxiety that formal proceedings in small communities always produced. They had pressed the coat into her arms with the careful efficiency of people who were completing a task they would not be thinking about tomorrow. They had given her the letter. They had told her the transport would take her as far as the boundary marker, and from there she would proceed on foot, and from there the pack would handle the rest of it. She had nodded. She had not cried in front of the council. She had not asked questions, because questions in a situation like that one were a form of hope, and hope was something she could not afford to carry into a place that was not built to hold it. She had asked her one question the night before in private, of a woman named Gret who lived 2 houses down and who had known Myra's mother before the fever, and who had therefore been, by default and without anyone choosing it, the closest thing Myra had to someone who looked at her like a person rather than a category. The question had been, what is the frozen pack actually like? Gret had been quiet for a long time. Then she had said, cold. Then she had said, very organized. Then she had said, they have not lost a member to fighting in 14 years, which is either evidence of great peace or great fear, and I have never been certain which. Then she had said, I am sorry, Myra, which was the truest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years and also the least useful. She kept walking. The ground was packed snow over frozen earth, and it crunched under each step with the specific sound of cold that had settled in and decided to stay until it was good and ready to leave. The boots were rubbing her right heel already. She was aware of this and did not favor the foot because favoring it would change her gait, and change her gait would change the impression she made. And the impression she made in the first minutes of arriving somewhere new was the only thing she could control. The boundary marker appeared when she was 20 yards from the tree line. Stone, waist-high, carved with symbols that were old and precise. The carving had been done by someone who understood their material and had taken time with it, which told her something about the people who had placed it. She stopped in front of it for a moment. She did not touch it. Then she walked past. The wind stopped the instant she crossed the marker's line. One step she was in it, the wind pushing at the too large coat and finding all the gaps the wrong size had left. The next step the air was absolutely still, and the silence that replaced the wind had a weight to it that was physical. She stopped again. The trees were close now, 10 yards ahead. The silence pressed against her from all sides equally. She had been in quiet places before, but this was different. This was a quiet that was doing something. She walked into the trees. The forest corridor was narrow, the trunks close enough on both sides that she could have touched them by extending her arms. The light changed from the flat white of the open ground to gray, a particular gray that was not dark exactly but was not transparent either, something in between. And the cold changed too, became more distilled and specific. The way cold in enclosed spaces was always more personal than cold in the open. She had taken 5 steps into the corridor when she heard it. Breathing. Not one breath, several, timed carefully, coming from both sides at once, which meant she was flanked, which meant someone had been watching her approach from the open ground and had moved into position without making a sound on snow that should have announced every footfall clearly. Her heel pain registered very precisely in that moment. a sharp and specific reminder that she was in borrowed boots in someone else's territory, and that these two facts were connected. She was not afraid. She was aware, which was not the same thing. She had learned the difference between those two states early enough that the distinction had become automatic. She stopped walking. She stood in the gray light of the corridor, and she breathed evenly, and she waited for a count of 3. Then she said, calmly and at a normal volume into the air in front of her, "I know you are there." The trees did not answer. "I am not going to run," she said. "I am also not going to pretend I do not notice you because that seems rude, and I was not raised to be rude." A pause. And then from her right, from between two trunks that showed her nothing but shadow, a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close enough to one to be identified as adjacent. Low, short, contained. She turned her head toward it. She could see nothing useful. "The boundary marker is behind me," she said. "I have the letter with the council's seal. Whatever your procedure is for what happens next, I will follow it if someone tells me what it is." The silence that came back was different from the one that had been there before. This one had awareness in it. Ears. She turned forward and walked on. The corridor opened into a clearing, and the clearing held the gate. It was iron, the same iron as the transport, dark and very old, and it rose twice her height without ornament. No handles she could see, no bell, no mechanism for announcing oneself. On both sides of it the wall continued into the trees until it vanished. The gate did not explain itself and the wall did not apologize for it. She stood in front of the gate and she was methodical. She looked for a bell first, checked the right side and then the left, checked the base of the gate and the wall sections immediately adjacent. Nothing. She pressed her palm flat against the gate and felt nothing move. The iron was cold the way iron in winter was always cold, which was thoroughly and completely and without any variation. She stepped back. She looked at the gate for 60 full seconds. She sat down in the snow. She did this without drama. She sat down because she had been on a transport for 3 days and walking for 40 minutes, and the right heel situation was already delivering consistent commentary, and there was nowhere to be and nothing to do until the other side of the gate decided to open it. She found a stable position, pulled the coat tight, and settled. The cold from the ground came up through her immediately. She had expected it. She breathed through it and looked up through the tops of the trees at the narrow strip of sky above the clearing. The sky was pale and flat and offered her nothing. She looked at it anyway because it was something to look at that was not the gate. She had been sitting for perhaps 5 minutes when she thought about the ring. Her mother's ring was in the inner pocket of the borrowed coat, which was exactly where she had put it when she left, and which was not where she had intended to put it. She had intended to put it on the table and leave it for Gret, who had admired it for 3 years and deserved to have it. She had picked it up from the small windowsill dish where it had lived since the fever, meaning to carry it to the table, and then her hand had put it in her coat pocket instead, and her hand had made a different decision from her mind, and she had let the hand win because she was tired, and because it was the morning she was being sent away, and there were limits to what she was going to fight herself about. She pulled it out now and looked at it. Plain gold, worn thin at the back where 30 years of a hand had turned it. Nothing remarkable to anyone who did not know it. The kind of ring that could be anyone's. Her mother had worn it until the week before the fever fully took her, when her hands had swelled too much for it to stay, and Myra had put it in the dish on the windowsill and it had lived there since. She turned it once in her fingers. She had brought the one thing that mattered to her and left behind everything practical. She had a ring and a letter she was not allowed to open, and a coat that belonged to someone else and boots that were eating her right heel. This seemed, in a way she found distantly and exhaustedly funny, like very accurate information about herself. She put the ring back in her pocket. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She had not slept properly in unfamiliar places since she was 15 and had learned that wakefulness in new environments was a form of care, and care was something she had been responsible for applying to herself for a long time. But she let her eyes close and she breathed and she listened instead of looking. Beyond the gate far enough that the distance made the sounds soft and imprecise, she could hear the things that meant living. Fire, movement on hard ground, voices too distant to be words but shaped the right way. A community doing what communities did in the morning and in the afternoon and through the day. She listened to those sounds and did not try to sort them into categories of safe and unsafe. She let them be what they were, which was evidence that the world on the other side of the gate was alive. She had been sitting for 38 minutes by her internal count when she heard the quality of the silence change. She had been tracking silences for a while by then. The first silence was the one after she had spoken into the corridor. The second was the one after the gate stopped being the only thing in the clearing. She heard this third one shift and opened her eyes. Through the narrow vertical strip between the gate's central columns she could see a sliver of the world beyond. She looked at it. In that sliver a shadow moved, then another. Then they were on her side of the gate. She had not seen the gate open. The first man was very tall, built in the way of someone for whom that build was purpose-made, dark hair close cropped, and a face that held the kind of lines that came from making hard calls for a long time in a row without a break in between. He looked at her sitting in the snow, and his expression was doing at least 3 things simultaneously, and she could not read any of them separately yet. The second man was the same height, differently proportioned, and he had a quality of constant and measured attention that reminded her, in the first instant, of someone listening to a piece of music they already knew in order to identify the variation from memory. They looked at her. She looked back. The first man's expression shifted incrementally while this was happening, and she still could not read it. The second man's expression was more controlled, but his eyes were doing more work than the first man's were, taking things in at a rate she found briefly impressive. She met the first man's eyes and said, in the level and carefully unhurried voice she used in formal situations, "Your gate does not have a bell." The second man blinked once. The first man said nothing. "I looked," she said. "There is no mechanism for announcing oneself from the outside. I found this genuinely inconvenient." "You sat down," said the second man. His voice was low and measured with the precision of someone who was used to choosing their words before they said them. "Yes," she said. "In the snow." "The snow is where the ground is," she said. A silence opened between them, not an uncomfortable one exactly, but one with a specific quality, the quality of people deciding how to proceed. "You are the offering," said the first man, not a question. His voice had the texture of certainty, not arrogance, just the confidence of a person who was accustomed to being accurate. "That is what they called me," she said. "That is what you are." She looked at him. "Is it?" she said. He looked back. Something moved in the expression, something small and not entirely comfortable. The second man glanced at the first man. One look, a single horizontal movement of the eyes. The look lasted perhaps a second. What it contained appeared to be an entire conversation, because neither man spoke for another moment, and yet the air between them had shifted by the time it was over. She watched them do this and noted the private language and filed it for later, when she had enough context to begin reading it. "Can you stand?" the first man asked. "Yes," she said. She stood, her right heel made its opinion known with precision. She showed nothing. "Then follow us," he said. She followed. She did not ask their names. She did not ask where they were going. She had learned that questions were indicators of need, and that indicators of need, used carelessly, gave other people information about the shape of you that they could use in ways you had not authorized. She would learn their names and the destination in time. The time was not yet. What she did was look. She looked at everything as they walked through the gate and into the compound, the systematic and deliberate inventory she performed in all new spaces. The compound was larger than she had expected, significantly larger. She had assembled from the things the village had told her over the years, an image of the frozen Pax territory as something severe and minimal, built for function over comfort, the kind of place organized around containment. What she found instead was a settlement that had been built and maintained with the intention of being lived in. The buildings were timber and stone, old but cared for. The roof lines were sound and the walls were straight, and the paths between them were worn smooth by consistent use and not by accident. The lights she could see through the windows were generous. The fires she could smell from the hall they were approaching were well fed. The people who moved between the buildings and stopped to look at her were wearing adequate clothing in the cold, and their faces were neither drawn nor pinched in the way of people who were not getting enough of what they needed. She counted without appearing to count, 40 visible, more implied by the scale of the space, by the number of buildings and the volume of the voices she could hear from inside them. She filed all of this. The building they led her to was at the center of the compound, the largest of the structures, and the interior, when the door opened and the warmth came out at her, hit her like a second thing after the wind at the boundary marker. Except this time the thing that hit her was not cold and hostile but warm and organized, and it went straight through the borrowed coat to the skin beneath it. She stood in the entrance for a moment and let her body adjust. She was aware that this adjustment was visible and that both men were watching it. She did not hurry it. She breathed through it and let the warmth find her, and when she was done adjusting, she moved inside. A woman came from a side corridor, around 40, dark-eyed and wearing an expression that did not perform anything. The kind of face that had been doing its actual work, rather than a performance of its work, for long enough that the two had become identical. She looked at Myra with the calm and measuring attention of someone who had watched a great many significant situations develop from close range and had learned to wait for the part that mattered. "Soren," said the second man. The woman looked at him briefly and then looked back at Myra. "You are frozen," she said. "A little," said Myra. "More than a little," said Soren. "Come." Myra followed her down a corridor and to the right and through a door and into a room that stopped her, just for a moment, without her meaning to be stopped. It was a private room. She had not had a private room in 3 years. She had been staying in the shared quarters of the village's communal house since her mother died, and the house they had lived in had been reallocated to a family with children who needed the space more than one adult did. She had managed. She was good at managing. But the fact of the room, the single bed and the window and the table and the lamp and the absence of any other person's things, was something she had not prepared for. 3 blankets were folded at the foot of the bed. She looked at the 3 blankets for longer than she should have. A basin of water sat on the floor beside the bed. She bent and touched the surface of it with one finger. Warm, it had been placed recently. In advance of her arrival, meaning someone had prepared this room for her specifically, with the expectation of her specific needs, and the warm water was evidence of that preparation. Soren set a covered dish on the table. "Eat," she said. "Rest, there is time for everything else." She left. Myra stood in the center of the room and looked at the 3 blankets. She had come prepared for the thing the village had described to her, which was the taking of someone who had no other choices to a place that would use them. She had packed her expectations accordingly. She had told herself that what mattered was adaptation, that she had adapted to every circumstance she had been placed in, and she would adapt to this one too, and that the key to adaptation was accurate observation without emotional interference. The 3 blankets were interfering with her observation. She sat on the edge of the bed and she pulled the ring from her pocket and she held it in her closed hand and she let the room exist around her, the warmth and the lamp already burning and the warm water and the food on the table. She sat with the feeling these things produced, which she could not name clearly yet, and she let it be nameless. She ate. The food was plain and good and enough, and she ate all of it with the efficiency of someone who had learned that eating when food was available was a form of intelligence. She tasted it. It was genuinely good. She removed the borrowed boots after and looked at her right heel. The skin was raw along the back edge, the contact line where the leather had been too large and had moved against her with every step. She had expected worse. She folded her socks carefully and placed them by the window. She set the ring on the table beside the lamp. She lay down on top of the blankets and looked at the ceiling and listened to the compound settle into its evening patterns. She could hear the hall growing quieter as the meal finished. She could hear somewhere beyond her wall the sound of regular movement and low voices doing the things that needed doing at the end of a day. All of it ordinary, all of it alive. She was aware that she was being careful about how much she let herself think about the 2 men. She had not been given their names and they had not given them. She had watched them have 2 conversations in one sideways look. She had seen the first man's expression do something small and unreadable when she asked if offering was what she was. She had noticed that the second man had positioned himself to watch the first man while also watching her, which was the thing someone did when they were tracking 2 things at once and considered both equally significant. She was aware that something had happened when she came through the gate. She could not have described it in terms that would have made sense to anyone else. She could only say that the air had a different quality when she was in the same space as those 2 men, a quality of attention that was not unpleasant but was not neutral either. She was aware that her body had registered this before her mind had, and her mind had not caught up yet. She was working on catching up. At some point in the evening she heard footsteps in the corridor. They slowed near her door. They did not knock. They did not try the handle. They paused for a moment that had the shape of a deliberate pause rather than an accidental one, and then moved on. She lay in the dark and breathed. She thought about the gate that had appeared to open without her being entirely certain she had watched it open. She thought about the silence in the trees that had ears in it. She thought about Soren saying there is time for everything else in the tone of someone who knew what the else was, and had decided the time for it was not yet tonight. She thought about the 3 blankets. She pulled 2 of them over herself without getting under them properly, just pulled them over like another layer of the borrowed coat, and she lay in the warmth, and she did not think about the village or the council or the letter she was not allowed to open. She thought about the ice crystals that had formed on the borrowed coat's sleeve during the walk from the boundary marker to the tree line, the small precise ones that had been shaped like stars, which she had found genuinely beautiful. They had melted when she entered the trees. She had minded losing them a little. She fell asleep somewhere between one breath and the next, which had not happened to her in a new place in longer than she could remember. The morning arrived in layers. The sounds came first before the light. The compound's earliest risers, the ones who did what needed doing before the general day began, moving on the paths outside with the particular sound of boots on cold ground. Then more voices joining the first. Then the smell of fires being built up in the hall, wood and smoke, and something that might have been grain cooking. These sounds and smells came in through the room's single window, which she had left unlatched against the cold because she needed the sound to come in, because the sound was information. She was awake before the light fully resolved. She lay still and took inventory. Right heel, sore but functional. Warmth. The room had held it through the night, which meant the building was properly insulated against the cold, which told her something about how the compound maintained itself. State of mind, alert and slightly forward-leaning in the way she got when she was processing something significant that had not yet resolved into conclusions. She dressed in the same clothes she had arrived in because she had nothing else. She pulled the socks on carefully over the right heel. She pushed her feet into the boots with the controlled expression of someone acknowledging a fact without dramatizing it. She set the ring in her pocket. She went to find out what the compound was. The main hall was large and long and warm in the reliable way of fires that had been tended consistently through the night. She stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, which was the thing she always did in rooms she was entering for the first time, taking in the general shape of it before committing to being inside it. 21 people at the morning meal, various states of wakefulness. 2 conversations happening at once, one large one involving 8 people down the center of the table and one smaller and more private one between 2 women at the near end. A child, perhaps 4 years old, climbing on the bench in a way that did not seem to alarm anyone, which told her something about the general temperature of the place. Several people registered her arrival in the doorway. Some returned to what they had been doing, the deliberate return of people making a choice. Some continued looking, which was also a choice. She met the eyes that held on her without looking away from any of them, and then she walked to the nearest empty seat and sat down. A young man across from her, maybe 19, with a sharp and openly curious face, looked at her without pretending he was doing something else. She found this preferable to the careful performance of not looking that some of the others were engaged in. "You are the one who sat in the snow," he said. "Yes," she said. "I heard from Tomas, who does the morning patrol. He seemed to feel this required no apology. Why did you sit down?" "Standing was a waste of energy," she said. He thought about this. That is a practical reason. "I am a practical person." He appeared satisfied. He told her his name was Pete, and that he had been in the compound since he was 8, which he said with the ease of someone who had come to terms with this fact long ago and did not consider it to require sympathy. He told her the grain in the bowl he was about to push toward her was better than it looked, and that the coffee was worse than it smelled. She accepted the grain. She learned that Pete had opinions about a great many things and shared them readily and without calculating whether sharing them served him in some way, which was the kind of self-possession that came either from security or from not having needed to develop the habits that insecurity produced. She suspected it was security. She hoped it was. She reserved the right to revise the assessment. She ate the grain and watched the hall, and she built her map. The hall had a social structure that was present but not rigid. She could see the gravitational centers, the people others oriented toward, but the orientation was voluntary and the authority it reflected had been earned rather than granted. She watched two men across the table disagree about something in the direct and undefensive way of people who trusted that the disagreement would not cost them anything. She watched a woman with gray-streaked hair at the far end of the table receive deference from the people around her, with the complete absence of interest in the deference that only people who had not ever needed it could manage. She watched Soren move through the hall from the kitchen direction, with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what needed doing and was doing it. The morning moved around her, and she sat in it and let it. She was on her second bowl of grain, which Pete had provided without asking whether she wanted it, and which she had accepted without ceremony when the child appeared. Small and very certain of herself, maybe 7 years old, with dark eyes that went directly at things and did not apologize for going directly. She came through the hall like she was on her way somewhere and stopped in front of Myra's seat, as if stopping in front of new people was simply a part of her route. "Are you staying?" she asked. Myra looked at her. The question had no layers in it. It was not strategic. It was a request for information from someone who wanted information and saw no reason not to ask for it directly. Myra opened her mouth and found that she had no answer ready, which was not a state she was accustomed to. She tried several answers internally in the space of a breath, and discarded each one because each one was either false or incomplete or more honest than she was prepared to be in a hall full of people who were watching her from various angles of not watching. "I do not know yet," she said. The child considered this with the gravity it deserved, nodded once, and continued through the hall. Myra sat with the space where her answer should have been and felt its shape. It was larger than she had expected. She had expected the question to feel simple. It did not feel simple. It had something inside it that was not simple at all, something she had been walking around since the 3 blankets and that she had not yet turned to look at directly. Pete was watching her. "That is Ada," he said. "She asks everyone who arrives." "Does she always ask it that way?" said Myra. "That directly?" "Yes," said Pete. "Soren says Ada has no patience for the long way around anything." Myra looked at the space the child had moved through. "What do people usually say?" "Usually something like 'yes, I think so' or 'I hope so.'" He paused. "One person said no, they left the next day. 2 people said yes and left after 3 months. Ada says those do not count." "She keeps track," said Myra. "Ada keeps track of everything," said Pete. "She will know your name by the morning meal tomorrow, and she will have asked Kale and Dax about you before the end of the week." Myra looked at him. "Kale and Dax," she said. "The Alphas," he said. She had their names now. She had been waiting for those. She filed them. She finished her breakfast and thanked Pete and went back to her room, and she stood at the window and she thought about what she had learned in the morning, and she thought about Ada's question and the space where her answer should have been, and she thought, you need more information before you can answer that. You need to know what this place actually is before you can decide whether you are going to stay in it. She went to find Soren. Soren was in a side room off the main corridor, doing something practical with dried herbs, and she looked up when Myra appeared in the doorway without looking startled, which suggested she had either heard the footstep coming or had been expecting this visit. "Can I help with something?" Myra said. "You do not need to," Soren said. "I understand that," Myra said. "I am asking whether I can." Soren set down the herbs. She studied Myra for a moment with the attentive and non-performative look she appeared to use on most things. "The stores need a proper count," she said. "No one has had time for it this week." "Tell me what I am counting," Myra said. Soren told her. The stores occupied 2 rooms at the back of the main building, and the logic of their organization became apparent to Myra in the first 10 minutes, once she stopped expecting it to follow the village's logic and started reading the compound's own. Preserved food organized by the season of its origin, because the season told you how long it had been there, and therefore how reliably it could be counted on. Medical supplies organized by urgency of need, with the things that addressed immediate crises at the front and the things for sustained or chronic situations behind. Workshop materials organized by frequency of use, so the items you needed constantly were always at hand. It was, she thought, the organization of people who had learned from experience what they actually needed and how quickly they needed it. She counted for 2 hours. She was thorough. She wrote clearly. At the end she had a full and accurate count of everything in the 2 rooms, plus a short list of items that were running lower than the other things around them, which she had noted without being asked to. She gave Soren the list. Soren looked at the count first, she looked at the gap list, she looked at Myra. "You noticed the gaps," she said. "They were there to notice," said Myra. Soren looked at the list again. "How are you with numbers in general?" "I am reliable with numbers," Myra said. "The compound's general accounts could use attention," Soren said. "If you have time." "I have time," said Myra. She spent the afternoon on the accounts. She was sitting at the table in the smaller of the two store rooms, working through a ledger that had not been looked at properly in several weeks, when she heard the door open at the back and looked up. The man whose name she now knew was Cale came through it. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her with the multi-layered expression she had not yet learned to read fully, and then he looked at the ledger, and then he looked at Soren, who had appeared behind him from the main room. Something passed between them, the fast and abbreviated communication she kept encountering here, and then Soren went back to what she had been doing. Cale looked at Myra. "You are here again," he said. "The ledger needs attention," she said. "You did not need to do that." "It needed doing," she said. He stood in the doorway of the storeroom for a moment. He was very still in a way that was not tension but its opposite, a stillness that came from having enough control of yourself that you were not using energy to manage yourself. She had seen this kind of stillness in very few people. "Come and walk," he said. "Where?" she said. "East. I will show you the older parts of the compound." She set down the pen. She followed him out through the back of the building and into the cold afternoon air of the compound, and they walked east together, not quite side by side but close enough, and the compound moved around them as they went. She did what she always did, which was look. She looked at the buildings more carefully than she had from a distance, noted the quality of construction in the old sections versus the additions, noted where resources had been concentrated and where less had been done. She looked at the people they passed, and the way those people responded to Cale's presence, the nods and the brief words and the general ease that said his authority here was unremarkable, not because it was taken for granted, but because it had been established long enough to become part of the landscape. He talked and she listened. He told her the Eastern Quarter had been the original settlement 300 years back, and the compound had grown outward from it as the pack grew and the territory stabilized. He told her which buildings had been built in which period of the pack's history without being encyclopedic about it, giving her the information she needed to orient herself and stopping when the orientation was achieved. He noticed when she had a question forming before she asked it and gave her space for the question, which was either observation or courtesy and was possibly both. They reached the eastern wall. It was the oldest part of the boundary, the original stone dark and different in texture from the newer sections, and along one section it had been repaired in two distinct styles. She had seen this from a distance on her afternoon walk the previous day. She saw it clearly now. "The mortar," she said. "Yes," he said. "Two different repairs." "Yes." "The first one was hurried," she said. She looked at the seams between the stones. "You can see it in the way the mortar was pressed in, unevenly in a hurry. The second repair was much more careful." He was quiet for a moment. "You are correct," he said. "What happened?" He told her. He told her about their father's death and the dispute about leadership that followed it, and the way the Eastern Wall had been the physical site of that dispute's climax, and the first repair that had been done before anyone had settled what came next. He told her about the second repair, 2 years later, 3 weeks of work that he and Dax had done together once the pack's direction had been established, and they had the time and the stability to do it carefully. She listened. She put her hand on the old stone. It was cold, it was always going to be cold, but it held. She pressed her palm flat against it and felt it press back solid and real. "You named him," she said. "Dax." "Yes," said Cale. "You have not given me either of your names until now," she said. He looked at her. "I was Cale in the gate." "That was the name, not an introduction," she said. Something in his expression shifted slightly. "Fair," he said. She kept her hand on the wall. "What is Dax short for?" "Nothing, it is his name entire." "Where does it come from?" "Someone who was significant to this pack a long time ago," he said. "A person worth naming someone after." She looked at the wall. She thought about the repairs. She thought about 3 weeks of careful work after 2 years of things settling. "I want to know what you actually want from me," she said. He was quiet. "Not the official answer," she said. "Not the procedure. Not what the letter says or what the framework says or what the structure of my situation suggests. What you personally want from a person who arrived through your gate today." He was quiet for longer than was comfortable. She waited. She was good at waiting. "To be honest with you," he said, "that is the first thing I want. Everything after it is secondary." She looked at the old stone under her hand. "The honest version involves things that are not mine alone to tell," he said. "Dax," she said. "Yes." She looked at the twice-repaired mortar, at the careful second seam. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. They walked back through the compound in the late afternoon light. The fires were being built up in the hall for the evening. The voices were multiplying as people came in from the day's work. She walked beside Cale and she thought about what he had said and what he had not said, and she thought that whatever came tomorrow was the shape of the situation she had not been given before she arrived, and that the shape of it might be anything, and she would have to stay clear enough to see it as it actually was rather than as she had been prepared to expect it. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she held the ring and she let the day settle in her. At the window, the last of the afternoon light was going. The lamp on the table threw its warm circle. The 3 blankets at the foot of the bed were exactly where they had been when she arrived. She set the ring on the table. She thought, "You have enough to go on with. You have the name of the place and the names of the people and the shape of the compound and the way the wall looks at the end of the day. You have the hall with Pete's saved seat, and the stores with Soren's careful organization and the child Ada who asked the question you could not answer. You have tomorrow and whatever it brings." She ate the evening meal Soren had left. She pulled the blankets over herself. She lay in the dark, and she let the compound's night sounds come through the window, and she did not catalogue the exits. She knew where they were. She did not catalogue them again. She let them be where they were, and she breathed, evenly and deliberately in the warmth of the room, and she thought about the ice crystals on the borrowed coat's sleeve, and how they had been shaped like very small and precise stars. She fell asleep wondering if she would see them again on the walk back out, if a walk back out became necessary. She did not know yet if it would. She was gathering information. The information was still incoming. Dax had been watching the compound's new arrival from the edges of things since the morning she came through the gate. He had not planned to do this in a systematic way. It had simply become systematic the way things became systematic when you were the kind of person who noticed things, and what you were noticing was significant enough to command the kind of attention that organized itself without being asked to. She was not what he had expected. He had anticipated several things, given the context. He had anticipated someone frightened, which people who arrived in this compound from difficult circumstances often were, even when they were doing a good job of not showing it. He had anticipated someone strategic, the kind of strategy that came from people who had been managing bad situations for long enough that strategy had become their first response to everything. He had anticipated someone who would perform whatever they thought the situation required. He had not anticipated her sitting in the snow in front of the gate with her eyes closed. He had not anticipated the total and complete absence of performance that was so absolute it looked, from the outside, almost like a performance of its own, until you looked long enough to see that it was not. He had been in the corridor when she arrived, which was where he had positioned himself once the sentinels reported back with the status that was not any of the statuses they had been trained to report. The offering is sitting down. She appears to be resting. She has her eyes closed. She is not asleep. She does not appear to be afraid. He had stood in the corridor and he had looked at Cale. Cale had looked back. The private language, which was the two of them having learned to speak in a compressed shorthand that had developed over years of working together in close proximity on problems that required fast decisions, said approximately this: "Go, now, yes, both of us, I know. He had gone with Cale. He had positioned himself one step behind and to the right, which was his default position in the first encounter with something new that Cale was leading, the position that let him observe both Cale and the situation with equal attention. He had watched Myra Voss stand up from the snow and speak to them with the same register you used with people you had known for years. And he had felt the thing that had been happening since she had crossed the boundary marker do something more specific, and he had noted the specificity and filed it for later. He had known what it was in the abstract from the founding records. He had read the relevant section 3 years ago when he was going through the records for a different reason, and had come across it and read it carefully and put it down and thought, this is theoretical. This will remain theoretical. This is the kind of provision that competent people write into founding documents for circumstances that will never require the provision to be used. He was now revising that assessment. He spent the second day doing the things he always did while also tracking her at the edges of his awareness, which was not something he had to try for. The compound was not large enough for you to misplace a person in it, not if you were paying attention, and he was always paying attention. He knew she had gone back to the stores after breakfast. He knew Soren had put her to work on the general accounts, and that she had worked through the afternoon on them with the focused and self-directed attention of someone who did not need to be managed. He went to check the stores in the late afternoon, as he occasionally did, and found her there with the ledger open and the pen moving steadily. He talked to Soren with one part of his attention and watched Myra with the other part. The way you looked at something diagonally when looking at it directly would change what it was doing. She was very good with numbers. The counts she was entering were precise and her notation system was clear and economical, the kind of system someone developed when they had been working with numbers for long enough to care about their own future efficiency. This was information about her. She was someone who thought about future her when she worked. She was someone who planned. He went back to his own work and thought about the letter in the incoming correspondence. He had not read it yet. He had seen it on the table that morning and identified it by the council's seal and had not yet picked it up. He had been putting off picking it up without admitting to himself that he was putting it off, which was a behavior he recognized from situations where some part of him already knew what something was going to say and did not want to read it in front of witnesses, even witnesses who were not paying attention. He went to the records room after the evening meal. He went specifically because it was where he went when he needed to be alone with something, and what he was going to do, which was read the letter from the village council, was something he needed to do alone. He read it once. He read it again. He set it down on the table. He sat in the quiet of the records room with the cold and the lamp, and the stacked and orderly history of the decisions this pack had made, and he read the word carrier 3 times, and then he looked at the iron grate in the corner. He burned the letter. He did it the way he did everything when he was certain it was the right thing but not entirely comfortable with what it meant. He did it carefully and without hesitation, fed it corner first so it would burn fully and leave no readable remainder. He watched it until it was ash, then he sat with the ash. He had burned evidence. He understood this. He had destroyed a document that had been sent to him and Kale by an external authority and that contained information that was relevant to the compound situation. He had made a unilateral decision without consulting his brother, which was a thing they had agreed 11 years ago not to do in matters of substance. The letter had used the word carrier. 11 years of building this pack, of taking what their father had left and putting it back together more carefully than it had been put together the first time, and every principle they had built on, every practice and every law and every expectation they had cultivated, said that people were not categories, and that the work of this compound was organized around that principle, because its absence was what had made their father's tenure the thing it had been. He was going to tell Kale. He was going to tell Kale about the letter and what it had said, and the fact that he had burned it. He was going to tell Kale all of it, but he needed the hours between now and that conversation to settle what it meant and how to say it, because the telling was going to be a significant conversation, and significant conversations required him to be clear before he had them. He also needed to think about Myra. He needed to think about what it meant that she had been sent without request. He had known, from the moment the Sentinels reported her status to him, that she was not someone who had arrived expecting to be a resource. Nobody who sat down in the snow in front of a gate and closed their eyes and waited with that quality of patience was someone who thought of themselves as something to be processed. But knowing what she was not was different from knowing what she was, and the letter had told him something specific about what the people who had sent her thought she was, and that specific thing was going to need to be said to her directly and clearly, and without softening. He was the one who did direct and clear and without softening. This was something he and Kale had worked out early, that their temperaments divided them into roles that suited each of their particular kinds of communication. Cale was direct too, but Cale's directness had a quality of weight to it, a gravity that sometimes made the thing being said feel heavier than it needed to feel. Dax was direct with a kind of precision that removed weight rather than adding it. He named things accurately and without additional pressure. He was going to need that precision for this. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and he thought about the ash in the iron grate and the gap between burning evidence of harm and undoing the harm itself. He thought about Myra at the table with the ledger, working on accounts that nobody had asked her to do because the accounts needed doing, and she was someone who noticed what needed doing and did it without waiting to be told. He thought, you burned the document is gone. The words in it no longer exist in the world. But she has been living in the world those words described for her entire life, and the burning does not change that, and the only thing that changes that is telling her the truth. He planned the conversation. On the third morning, Myra woke before first light again and lay still and listened to the compound wake up, and she thought about what she had learned, and what she did not know yet, and what she was going to do about the gap between those two things. She was going to the hall. She was going to continue building her understanding of the people who lived here. She was going to continue doing whatever work presented itself, because work was the fastest way she knew to understand a place, because it put you in contact with the practical requirements of the space in a way that conversation alone did not. And she was going to wait for the conversation Cale had told her was coming today, the one that involved what Dax had to say. She dressed and went to breakfast and sat with Pete. Pete had, without discussion, established a pattern in which he saved the seat across from him, and she sat in it and they ate together, and he talked and she listened and contributed when she had something to contribute, and did not contribute when she did not, and he seemed to find this arrangement completely satisfactory. She found it, in a way she had not expected to find anything in this place yet comfortable. She was thinking about what comfortable meant in a place she had arrived in under the terms she had arrived in when Pete said, "Lena is looking at you again." She looked toward the far end of the table. The woman with the gray-streaked hair was looking at her with the direct and expressionless attention she had been giving her since the first morning meal. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of steadiness in the face that was the residue of a great many situations survived. She held Myra's gaze without either looking away or altering her expression. Myra held it back. "Who is Lena?" she said. "She has been here longer than almost everyone," Pete said. 30 years. She came when she was young and stayed. He said this without further elaboration, as if the fact of staying for 30 years was self-explanatory. If Lena thinks you are worth paying attention to, everyone knows it. Does she think I am worth paying attention to? She is looking at you, he said. She has been looking at me since the first morning. Yes, said Pete. He seemed to consider this definitive. Myra looked at her grain. What does Lena do here? Workshop, he said. Textiles and things that need craft. She teaches people who want to learn. Myra filed this. She was in the stores after breakfast with Soren when Cale came for her in the early afternoon. She had been expecting him, and she had been doing the accounts, and she had thought about whether to bring the ledger with her, and decided to leave it where it was because whatever the afternoon was going to involve was not the kind of thing you wanted to be holding something in your hands for. Cale said, "Come to my office." She followed him to a room off the main building's northern corridor, which she had not been in before. It was not large, with a desk and 2 chairs and a window that faced east. Dax was already there, standing by the window. She had been in the same spaces as Dax several times in the past 3 days, but had not been in the same room with him specifically, and the room's different geometry made his presence more specific, easier to read. He was watching her come in the same way he had been watching her from distances, with the measured and comprehensive attention, but from here she could see the specific quality of it more clearly, the quality of someone gathering information rather than passing judgment. She sat in one of the chairs. Cale sat in the other. Dax remained standing by the window. "I want to tell you some things," Cale said. "Yes," she said, "that is why I am here. Some of them are complicated." "Most true things are," she said. Cale looked at her for a moment. "The bloodline," he said. "I know about the bloodline," she said. He stopped. "I have known since I was 12 years old," she said. "My village was not skilled at concealing things they were very interested in. The level of attention they paid to my health and to my lineage was not consistent with the level of attention they paid to anyone else, And I eventually asked a woman there who had known my mother what they were being so careful about. She looked at Cale and then at Dax. She told me. I was 12. I have had 10 years to become accustomed to what it means. Silence. What it means to them, she said. What it means to you may be different. Cale looked at Dax. The letter, Dax said. She waited. He told her what the council had sent, the words they had used, the words specifically that had made him burn it. He told her that the pack had never sent a request for an offering, that the council had acted entirely on their own initiative, that they had identified her as the most useful thing they possessed and packaged her accordingly and sent her with the letter as the invoice. She sat with this. She had known, in the peripheral way you knew things you had not been told, that she had not been sent in response to a specific request from this pack. The quality of her reception here, the preparation that had been made for her arrival, did not have the texture of something that had been eagerly anticipated. But knowing something in the peripheral way and being told it explicitly by the person who had read the letter and then burned it were different experiences. The word they used, she said. Dax looked at her steadily. Carrier, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at the desk. She thought about being 12 years old and asking the woman who had known her mother what they were all being so careful about, and she thought about the word the woman had used, which had not been carrier but had been functionally identical to carrier, a word that said, "You are the thing that contains the thing we want, and the thing we want is not you." You burned it, she said. Yes, he said. Before I knew it existed. Before you arrived, he said. She looked at him. Yesterday morning, he said, in the records room, I went there alone to read it and I burned it there. She thought about this. Was that yours to do, she said. No, he said, it was not. It was a document sent to this compound and I destroyed it without consulting anyone. That was a unilateral decision, and it was my decision alone, and I am telling you I made it. She looked at the desk again. She thought about the word carrier and what it meant to have it burned by someone who thought it had no right to be in the world, and she thought that this was not a solution to anything, but that it was also not nothing. There is something else, Cale said. She looked at him. He told her about the claiming. He told her carefully and without softening. He told her what it was and how it worked and when it had happened, which was the moment she had crossed the boundary marker, and he told her that it had happened to both of them simultaneously, which had not happened before in the history of this pack, and which the founding law addressed directly. He told her the law. She listened to the law with full attention, and she asked questions, the specific and detailed kind that went at the thing being said from several different angles. She asked about the mechanics. She asked about the obligation it placed on her versus the obligation it placed on them. She asked about the right of refusal and what refusal meant in practice. She asked whether refusal changed her situation in the compound or her access to the space or the care she received. Each question was answered directly. No question was deflected. No answer contained any pressure, not in the words and not in the silence around them. She sat with everything she had been told for a long moment after the questions were done. Both of you, she said finally. Yes, said Cale. At the same time. Yes, said Dax. Has that ever happened? Not in the records we have, said Dax. The law was written as a theoretical provision. None of us expected to use it. She looked at the window, the eastern light the same direction as the old wall. The law says I have to agree freely, she said. Yes, said Cale, full agreement with full information without pressure or deception. And if I refuse? You remain here, everything else remains exactly as it has been. Nothing changes except the bond stays incomplete. She looked at him. What does that mean for you? He was quiet for a moment. It means we live with it, he said. People live with a great many things they cannot act on. This would be one of those things. She looked at Dax. The same, he said. She thought about this carefully. She thought about what it would mean to refuse, not as a performance or a test, but genuinely, what it would mean to stay in this compound and build a life here under the current structure and let the bond sit incomplete. She thought about whether that was possible. She thought about the fact that she had been here 3 days and already she had a list of things she had not expected to find. The grain Pete pushed across the table, the 3 blankets, Soren's stored accounts, Ada's direct question, the old wall with its twice-repaired mortar. She thought about how the list was still forming. She said, "I have a question, and I need you to answer it honestly." "Yes," said Dax. She looked at each of them in turn. "If I had no bloodline," she said. "If the thing I carry in my blood that 3 generations of this pack have wanted did not exist. If there were nothing about me that any council or pack could calculate a use for, would you both still be sitting in this room with me?" Neither of them hesitated. "Yes," said Kale. "Yes," said Dax. She read their faces. She used the full and direct and unmasked attention she used on things she needed to understand accurately. She looked for the thing underneath the thing they were saying, the thing that might contradict it or complicate it. She looked for the calculation she had learned to look for in the faces of people who said things that were convenient for them to say. She did not find it. She did not immediately conclude that finding nothing meant there was nothing. But she noted the absence. "I need time," she said. "Take it," said Kale. "I'm not saying no," she said clearly. "I am saying I need to know this place before I can say yes honestly, and a yes that is not honest is worth nothing to any of us." Dax's expression moved slightly. "That is exact," he said. "A week," said Kale. "Take a week, do what you have been doing. At the end of the week, if you know your answer, tell us. If you do not, take more time." She looked at him. "What if I need more than a week?" "Then you take more than a week," he said. She sat in the chair in the office with the eastern light through the window, and she thought about the twice-repaired mortar and the careful second job and the 3 weeks it had taken, and she thought that she understood something about the people she was looking at that she had not understood when she arrived. "The founding records," she said to Dax. "Can I read them?" "I will have them in the hall tomorrow morning," he said. She stood up. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. She was not in the habit of thanking people for things they had not done for her benefit, but she meant this. They had told her the truth. They had told her the difficult parts of it along with the easier parts. They had not softened the word carrier, and they had not softened the law, and they had not softened the honest answer to her honest question. She went back to the stores and she finished the accounts. She ate the evening meal in the hall with Pete, and she listened to the conversations around her, and she thought about a week, and what a week was long enough to learn. She went to her room and she set the ring on the table and she looked at it and she thought, "You have enough to go on with. You have the name of the thing and the shape of the law. You have the answer to the question you asked. Now you need to find out if you believe it." She lay down. She breathed. She did not calculate the exits. Not deliberately not calculating, just not calculating, the way you sometimes did not think about a thing, because the thing was not urgent enough to demand the space. She noticed this before she fell asleep. She held the noticing carefully, like something that had not fully resolved its shape yet. The founding records arrived in the hall the next morning as Dax had said they would. They were in a cloth binding, the kind meant to protect something that was used and not just stored, and they were sitting on the end of the table by the door when she came in. She picked them up. Pete watched her do it with the open curiosity he brought to everything. "What are those?" "The pack's founding records," she said. He considered this. "Are you allowed to read those?" "Dax left them for me," she said. "I am going to assume that means yes." "That seems like a reasonable assumption," Pete said. She put the records in her room after breakfast and went to the stores first, because the accounts were not quite finished and she had said she would finish them, and she was not a person who said she would do something and then did not do it. She finished the accounts by mid-morning, and then she went back to her room and she sat at the table by the window and she read. The founding records were comprehensive. They had been written by someone who understood that the purpose of a founding document was not to describe the present but to account for the future, which meant they addressed not just what the pack was at the time of writing, but what it might become and what should be true in those circumstances. The section on governance was detailed and practical. The section on territory was specific and legally structured. The section on care of pack members was, she thought, the most carefully written section of all, the one where the person who had written it had put the most thought into the question of what they were actually trying to create. She found the dual claiming law on the 43rd page. She read it once. She read it twice. She sat with it. The law was written in 2 parts. The first part described what the claiming was, how it worked, what it meant in terms of the bond and its effects on the people in it. This part was technical and precise, and she read it with full attention and several rereads of the parts that contained vocabulary she was not already familiar with. The second part was the part about her. It addressed with the same precision as the first part but with a different quality of care, the rights and protections of the person who had been claimed. It was written as if the person who had written it had spent time thinking about what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of this situation. It said, in formal language but clearly, this person did not choose this. This is a thing that has happened to them. Therefore the law exists to ensure that nothing else is done to them without their full consent, and full understanding, and full freedom to say no. She sat in the chair by the window for a long time after reading that. She was not precisely moved. She was something more specific than moved. She was recalibrating. She was taking in information that required her to adjust the framework she had been using to understand her situation, and adjusting the framework was work, and the work was uncomfortable in the specific way that revising a long-held understanding was always uncomfortable. She had arrived here expecting to be used. She had come prepared for use in the way that people came prepared for the inevitable, with the particular flatness that was not quite acceptance, but was the next thing after the stage where you stopped fighting. She had packed her expectations with care, and the expectations had said, "You are going to be in a place where you are a resource, and you are going to adapt to being a resource with as much dignity as you can manage." The law on page 43 did not say resource. The law on page 43 said, her choice. Her choice about everything first and above all other considerations. Her choice freely given or not given, and if not given then nothing proceeds, and nothing about her situation changes as a consequence of her not giving it. This was not what she had packed for. She stood up. She put the records down on the table with the ring. She went to find Lena. Lena was in the workshop, a long room in the western building where the light came in from 3 windows and landed on the work benches in a way that was clearly deliberate, oriented to give the best light to the people working at them. She was working with thread, dark thread in several colors, doing something with her hands that Myra could not immediately identify as a finished product, but that had the quality of something that was going somewhere. Lena looked up when Myra appeared in the doorway. She had been waiting for this visit, Myra thought. Not because she had been told to expect it, but because Lena was the kind of person who understood the rhythms of how newcomers moved through a space, and she had been watching long enough to know when one of them would arrive at her door. "Sit," said Lena. Myra sat. The workshop was quiet. Several other people were working at the other benches, but the quality of the quiet was the quiet of people who were doing something with their hands, and their minds were partly elsewhere, the productive and comfortable quiet of people who trusted the space they were in. "You want to know what I think," said Lena. "Yes," said Myra. "I want to know what 30 years of being here feels like from the inside." Lena looked at her. The direct and assessing look that had been directed at her across the breakfast table since the first morning. At this distance, she could see more of what was in it. The look was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. It was the look of someone who had stopped performing responses a long time ago and had reached the place on the far side of performance where you could simply see things and say what you saw. "I was 14, Lena said. "When I came, my family's territory was failing and my family made an arrangement to secure their position. I was part of the arrangement." Myra waited. "I was not asked," Lena said, "about the arrangement. I was told about it 3 days before I left. My father thought he was doing right by me, I think now. At the time I thought he was doing right by himself, and I was the convenient instrument of it." A pause. "The truth is probably somewhere between those two things, which is how the truth usually is." "Yes," said Myra quietly. "I was furious for the first year," Lena said. "Not visibly furious because I was also practical and I understood that visible fury in a new place was expensive. But internally I was furious at everything. The walls and the meals and the people who tried to be kind to me, because the kindness felt like something I was supposed to be grateful for and I did not want to be grateful. I wanted to go home." "But home was gone," said Myra. "Home was gone," Lena agreed. "Which meant the fury had nowhere to resolve, which made it worse, which made the first year very long." Myra looked at the thread in Lena's hands, and then it started to become a different kind of long, the long of a year that is actually full rather than just endless. Lena worked the thread through a sequence of movements. I did not wake up one morning and find that everything had changed. It was slower than that. There were days that were easier than the day before, then more of those days, then the easier days started being the majority. Then one morning I woke up and I wanted to know how the day was going to go, and that wanting was because I was interested, not because I was calculating how to manage it. Myra was quiet. "I'm not telling you what to decide," Lena said. "I am not in a position to tell you that. What I am telling you is that I have been here for 30 years and I have not wanted to leave for 29 of them, and I am telling you that as a fact rather than as an argument." Myra looked at the window, the cold light through the glass the same gray it always was. "The first year," she said, "did you count the exits?" "Every morning," Lena said, "before I got out of bed." "When did you stop?" Lena was quiet for a moment. "One morning I did not do it and did not notice until midday that I had not. I sat with that for a long time." A pause. "I have never been able to tell whether I stopped because things had become better or whether things had become better because I stopped." Myra thought about this. "What are you making?" she said, looking at the thread. "Nothing yet," said Lena. "I am learning the material first. You have to know what a thing can hold before you know what to build with it." They looked at each other across the workshop. "That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me since I arrived," said Myra. "I know," said Lena. "It is the most useful thing anyone said to me too. I heard it in my second year here from someone who has been gone a long time now. I have been saying it to people who come through since." Myra rose. "Thank you," she said. "Come back," said Lena. "Not because you owe me a return visit, because I would like to know how you are." Myra went to the stores and she helped Kit with the afternoon inventory, and Kit talked steadily about the compound's current supply situation with the comfortable authority of someone who had been managing a specific domain for long enough to find it genuinely interesting. And Myra listened and asked questions and did the counting as directed and did not think about Lena's words, because she was saving them for when she was alone. She was in the kitchen for the dinner preparation, helping Soren and two others with the meal, when she heard Kale's voice outside. She did not go to see. She had learned that he moved through the compound differently than she would have expected of someone with his level of authority, not with the constant assertion of presence that authority sometimes insisted on, but with the ease of someone who had been the same person in this space for long enough that the space did not require him to remind it. She heard Dax's voice too later, and she noticed that she recognized it before she saw him, which was information about how her mind had been categorizing things without her asking it to. She went to bed with the founding records on the table beside the ring and she lay in the dark, and she thought about Lena in her first year, counting the exits before she got out of bed, and she thought about the morning Lena had not counted them and had not noticed until midday. She thought about whether she was in her first year or whether she was already past something. She thought, "It has been 3 days, you cannot know yet, give it the week." She gave it the week. On the 4th day she walked past the southern gate in the afternoon and did not note the locking mechanism. She was walking toward Lena's workshop because she had decided to go back as Lena had asked, and the southern gate was on the path between her starting point and her destination. She walked past it and continued and was 3 buildings further on before something in her mind reported what had just happened. She stopped on the path. She turned and looked back. The southern gate was behind her. She could see it from here. Wooden frame, iron fittings, the latch mechanism visible at this distance as a darker shape against the wood. She had not catalogued it. She had not, as she passed it, run through the assessment she had done twice already, the check of the latch and the state of the hinges and the specific resistance a person would encounter if they needed to use it quickly. She had passed it and thought about other things. She stood on the path and she held this fact in her mind, and she felt its shape. She was not sure what to do with it. She was not sure whether it was information about her situation changing or information about a single afternoon being different from the other afternoons. She put it carefully in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed more data before they could be understood. She went to Lena's workshop. Lena was not alone this time. A young man was working at one of the other benches, maybe 16, learning something with the careful attention of a person to whom the learning is new enough to require all of him. Lena was working beside him, occasionally adjusting the position of his hands, occasionally saying something quietly that Myra could not hear from the doorway. Myra came in and sat on the bench along the far wall, which was the bench Lena had not gestured her to specifically, but which seemed to be the appropriate one, and she watched Lena teach. Lena was good at it. The teaching had the quality of something that had been done long enough to be natural, not the self-consciousness of someone who was aware of their own pedagogy. She corrected without making the correction feel like a failure. She demonstrated without making the demonstration feel like a show. When the young man produced something that was close to right, she acknowledged it as close to right rather than as right, which meant he understood the difference, and also that she was paying proper attention. After a while, the young man gathered his things and left, nodding at Myra as he passed, and Lena came and sat on the bench across from her. "How are you?" Lena said. "I walked past the southern gate," Myra said. "On the way here, I did not note the locking mechanism." Lena looked at her. "I noticed about halfway down the next block," Myra said, "that I had not done it." "Yes," said Lena. "It might have been an oversight," Myra said. "It is early." "Yes," said Lena. "But it happened." "Yes," said Lena. She picked up a length of thread from the bench and worked it through her hands in the way she always did, the steady and familiar movement. "The first time I did not count the exits, I told myself the same thing. Might have been an oversight, too soon to know." "Probably does not mean anything." Myra looked at the floor. Did it mean something? "It meant," Lena said, "that some part of me had started to trust the space more than I was willing to admit to the rest of me." Myra sat with this. She thought about trust as a thing that operated in parts of you before the rest of you had agreed to it. She thought about the body knowing things the mind was still working on. She thought about her hand putting the ring in her pocket when her mind had been planning to leave it on the table. "I am going to keep paying attention," she said. "Yes," said Lena, "that seems right." She walked back through the compound from the workshop through the southern path past the gate. She paused this time. She looked at it deliberately. She catalogued the latch, the hinges, the general condition, the specific amount of resistance you would encounter. She held the catalogue in her mind for a moment. Then she let it go and walked on. Not because she was choosing to let it go in a way that made a statement. Because she had done the thing and the thing was complete, and she did not need to carry it. She went to the hall for the evening meal. Cale was there at the far end of the table, talking to two men she had not yet learned the names of. He did not look toward her when she came in. She sat down with Pete, and the evening meal went on around her. Dax came in late. He came through the kitchen door and stood for a moment doing what she had learned was his thing, the full read of the room, quick and comprehensive, before coming to the table. He sat down across from Cale, 2 seats from Myra, and he looked at her once with the measuring attention and then looked at the food in front of him. She thought about what it meant to have 2 people in a room who were experiencing a significant and apparently uncomfortable thing, because she was in the room, and who were both being so scrupulous about not making that her problem that they were not even looking at her directly more than necessary. She thought about the founding records and the part that said her choice above all other things. She thought, this is what it looks like when people mean what they say. On the 5th day, she helped Prue in the stores. Prue was Kit's counterpart in the southern stores, quieter and more precise in her way, and she had been looking at Myra since the first morning with the same careful horizontal gaze of someone who was not ready to reach a conclusion, but was gathering information. Myra had been watching Prue in return. She had assessed Prue as someone who said fewer things than most people but whose things were more specific, and she was curious about what Prue's specific things would turn out to be. They worked through the morning in the mostly comfortable silence of 2 people who did not feel compelled to fill space with noise. Myra counted and Prue verified, and the work went faster than it would have gone with one person. At the end of the morning, Prue said without looking up from what she was doing, "The letter they sent said carrier." Myra went still. "Soren saw it," Prue said, "before Dax burned it. She told me because she thought you should know that we know, and that it does not change anything." Myra looked at the shelf she had been counting. "Who else knows?" she said. "Soren and me," said Prue. "Soren told me specifically because she thought I should hear it from her before I heard it from somewhere else, in case the somewhere else made it sound different from what it is." "What is it?" said Myra. Prue set down her pen and looked at her. "It is something that someone else said about you," she said. "It is not what you are." Myra held very still. You are a person, Prue said, who arrived through the gate and helped count the stores the next morning without being asked, and whose accounts are the clearest ones we have had in 2 years. She picked up her pen again. That is what you are to me. The other thing is what someone who did not know you wrote about you for their own purposes, and it stopped being true the moment you walked through that gate. Myra looked at the inventory in her hands. She thought about the word carrier, which she had lived inside for 10 years without knowing that was the word the village had used for her, and she thought about it stopping being true, which was the kind of thing someone said that you wanted to believe was simple. Thank you, she said. We do not thank each other here for telling the truth, said Prue. It is the expected standard. Myra went back to the counting. On the 6th day, Cale came to find her at the eastern wall. She had been walking without a destination, which was itself a thing she had not done since arriving. She had been walking with destinations, with places to be and things to do and work to accomplish, because having destinations kept her in contact with the practical reality of the compound, and the practical reality of the compound was what she was trying to understand. But on the 6th day she had woken up and the morning had felt different, less urgent in its requirement for practicality, and she had eaten breakfast with Pete and then walked without specific direction. She had arrived at the eastern wall. She was standing with one hand on the stone when she heard him coming. She had learned his footstep pattern the way she learned all things, without specifically intending to. He came to stand beside her. They looked at the wall together. You keep coming here, he said. Not an accusation, an observation. It is honest, she said. He looked at the twice-repaired mortar. Yes, he said, it is. The second repair, she said. You and Dax did it yourselves. You said it took 3 weeks. Yes. Why yourselves? The pack was functional by then, you said. You could have assigned it. He was quiet for a moment. Because we had broken it, he said. In the dispute after our father died, not literally, that was someone else. But the dispute was between us, and we let it go on long enough that it reached this wall. We repaired it ourselves because it was our thing to repair. She looked at the mortar, the careful line of it. Did that help? The 3 weeks, he thought, yes. There is something about doing a specific and physical task together that resolves things that conversation does not reach. By the end of the 3 weeks the dispute was over, not because we had talked it out, because we had built something together and it held. She pressed her palm flat against the stone. What was the dispute about, she said. He did not answer immediately. She let the pause exist without rushing it. Who led first, he said. In a dual alpha arrangement, someone leads the practical decisions and someone leads the strategic ones. We both wanted the practical decisions. A pause. We were both wrong about which role suited us. In the end, Dax took the strategic decisions because he was better at them and he knew it, and I eventually admitted it. She looked at him. You are the one people come to, she said, when something needs to be handled immediately. Yes, he said, that is the practical decisions. And Dax is the one who knows what the founding records say, she said. Something in his expression shifted toward something that was adjacent to warmth. Yes, he said. She turned back to the wall. I am going to say yes, she said. I am not saying it now because I said I needed a week, and I want the week to complete itself properly, but I want you to know that the direction I am going is yes. He was very still. I am telling you now, she said, so that you are not in suspense for another day, which seems needlessly unkind given everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Thank you, he said. Do not thank me, she said. I am doing this because I want to, not as a courtesy to either of you. I know, he said. I am thanking you for telling me in advance. She looked at the wall. Will Dax know, she said. Yes, he said, I will tell him. She nodded. She stood at the eastern wall for another few minutes, and then she walked back into the compound, and she went to Lena's workshop, and she told Lena too, because Lena had given her something real, and Lena deserved to know what had happened to it. Lena listened. She looked at Myra for a moment after. Good, she said, simply that. Myra went to bed. She lay in the dark and she did not count the exits and she did not think about whether she was being unwise or moving too fast or letting something that was not what it appeared to be get past the defenses she had built. She had thought about all of those things already. She had given them their proper time. She had decided. The deciding was done. She thought about the morning. She thought about what the morning was going to be. She thought about Lena's thread, and the thing it was going to become once Lena knew enough about what it could hold. She fell asleep quickly, which had been happening more often, which was information she had started to stop needing to file quite so carefully. The 7th morning was still and very cold. She was awake before dawn, which was not unusual, but the quality of the wakefulness was different from how it had been on other mornings. Less calculating, not the wakefulness of someone assessing the situation, the wakefulness of someone who had made their assessment and was waiting for the day to begin. She lay in the dark and she thought about the ring on the table, and she thought about the word she had said to Kale at the eastern wall, which was yes, or the direction of yes, and she thought about what that meant in the language of her own life, what the shape of it was when you placed it against everything that had come before it. She thought about her mother, who had been practical and unglamorous, and who had loved her consistently, and without making a performance of it, which was the kind of love that did not announce itself, and was therefore sometimes invisible to people looking for love that announced itself, and which she had understood the value of only after it was gone. She thought about what it would mean to build something here, not metaphorically. Actually, she thought about what her days would look like in a year, in 5 years, in the period of time that turned a newcomer into someone like Lena, who had been here long enough that the compound had shaped her as much as she had shaped it. She thought about the accounts and the stores and Pete and Ada and Soren's precise and caring efficiency and Lena's thread and the eastern wall. She thought about Kale and Dax with less of the careful analytical distance she had been maintaining and more of the specific and honest attention the situation deserved. She thought about what it felt like to be in the same room as both of them, which was a feeling she had been cataloging with the same systematic attention she applied to everything else, and which she had therefore been somewhat avoiding looking at directly, because looking at it directly required her to acknowledge that she was not neutral about it, and she had needed to be neutral long enough to be sure. She was sure. She got up. She dressed. She picked up the ring from the table. She held it for a moment and she thought about Gret, who had admired it for 3 years and deserved to have it. She thought about the windowsill where it had lived and the dish it had lived in and the hand that had worn it for 30 years before that. She thought about what the ring had meant to her in each of the places she had carried it through, the 3 years on the windowsill and the 3 days on the transport and the 7 days in this room. She put the ring in her pocket. She went out into the corridor. The compound was very quiet. Pre-dawn, the fires not yet built up, the paths empty. The cold was specific and exact, the deep cold that came just before the sky began to commit to the day. She went east. Kale and Dax were already at the wall. She had not told them to meet her here. She had not said where she would say the actual yes rather than the direction of yes, which she had only said to Kale, who had said he would tell Dax. But they were here, both of them, standing side by side with space between them that was exactly the right amount of space for a third person to stand in if a third person arrived. She walked to the space between them. She put her hand on the wall. The stone was cold. The twice-repaired mortar was precise beneath her fingertips. The morning was still and the compound was quiet behind them, and ahead of them the trees were dark and patient. "All right," she said. Neither of them spoke immediately. She looked at Kale. She looked at Dax. She said, "I am not saying this because of the bloodline. I am not saying it because of the law. I am not saying it because I was sent here and have nowhere else to go, because that is not accurate. I could have left. I noted both gates." She looked at the wall. "I am saying it because I walked past the southern gate 4 days ago and did not note the locking mechanism, and because Pete saves the seat across from him without asking, and because Lena has been here 30 years and did not leave, and because you burned a document that called me a word I was not, before I knew it existed." She turned to look at both of them. "I am saying it," she said, "because this wall was broken and then repaired twice, and the second repair was done carefully by the people who had a reason to do it carefully, and it held." She pressed both hands against the stone. She felt Kale's hand come to rest beside hers on the right. She felt Dax's hand come to rest beside hers on the left. The morning light came over the top of the eastern wall. She had not planned for the light to come at exactly that moment. It simply did, clearing the top of the wall as their 3 hands were on the stone together, and it fell across the old gray surface and the careful mortar and the 3 of them standing in it, and it was warm in the particular way of first morning light, which was the warmest thing in the world. The ritual was the words in the founding records. She had read them carefully and she knew them, and saying them now was different from reading them by the window in her room because saying them had weight that reading did not, the weight of something committed to in the presence of the things it was committing to. She said her part in the level and even voice she had always used, and it was the same voice but different underneath, because the levelness was not distance this time. It was simply how she sounded when she was steady. Cale's voice was low and certain. Dax's voice was quiet and exact. 3 voices at the eastern wall at dawn, in the cold that was starting to ease as the morning came over it, and the compound behind them beginning to wake up in its sounds. She lifted her hand from the stone. She turned away from it. She walked back toward the main hall. Cale walked on her right. Dax walked on her left. She went through the compound in the morning light between them, and the paths were familiar now in the way of things you had walked enough times that they were yours, not because you had claimed them but because you had learned them and they had learned you back. The fires were building up in the hall. She could smell the grain cooking. She could hear Pete's voice from inside, saying something that made someone respond. She pushed open the door of the hall and went in. Pete was in his seat. He had saved the one across from him. She went to it and sat down. He pushed the grain toward her without comment. She accepted it. Soren came out of the kitchen and looked at her, and did not say anything, but her face said something. The face of someone who had watched a great many significant things happen from close range, and who knew the look of one completing. Ada came through the hall at mid-morning. She came through the adults with her usual certainty, her determined 7-year-old certainty that her presence was expected and her questions were valid, and she stopped in front of Myra and she looked at her with the direct brown eyes. "Are you staying?" she said. Myra looked at her. She thought about the first time Ada had asked this question and the space where her answer should have been. She thought about that space and what had lived in it and what had filled it in the 7 days between the first asking and this one. She thought about how the space had not been empty even then, only unread, and she had spent the 7 days learning to read it. "Yes," she said. Ada nodded once. She moved on through the hall. Myra picked up her spoon. The bad coffee was on the table. Dax had apparently carried it out from the kitchen and set it down without drawing attention to this, and she reached for a cup and wrapped both hands around it. It was genuinely terrible coffee. She had developed over the past week the specific tolerance for it that you developed for things that were part of your daily life, and that had virtues that compensated for their obvious failures, and the virtues of this particular coffee were warmth and consistency, and the fact that it was present every morning in a cup that someone had thought to provide. She drank it. She thought about the eastern wall and the morning light over the top of it. She thought about the twice-repaired mortar and the 3 weeks of careful work and the thing that held because it had been done properly the second time. She thought about the ring in her pocket. She would put it on the windowsill, she thought, later when she went back to her room. Not because she needed to look at it from across the room, because it was hers and this was her room and she could have things in it that were simply good. She thought about asking Dax to show her the mortar work. The careful kind, the kind that required knowing the material and the temperature and the weight the seam had to carry. She thought he would say yes. She thought she would learn it. She thought about what else she would learn here in the time that was ahead, in the year and the years beyond the year, and the thinking did not feel like planning in the calculating sense of planning but like imagining, which was different, which was what you did when the future felt like yours. She ate her breakfast. She talked to Pete, who had opinions about the new arrangement in the supply rotation that he was ready to share in detail. And she listened and asked questions, and found the questions genuinely curious rather than strategic, which was the specific and unremarkable thing that kept surprising her about this place, that the questions she asked here had started to be curious rather than defensive. Cale was in the hall after the morning meal, speaking with 2 people she had met 3 days ago and who had started to feel like they had names rather than like they were data points in her map. He looked up when she crossed the hall and their eyes met and she nodded once. He nodded back. She thought, this is what it looks like at the beginning. This ordinary morning in the hall, the grain and the bad coffee and Pete's opinions and Soren's efficiency and Ada doing her rounds, and 2 tall men who had told her the truth when the truth was difficult, and had waited when waiting was what was asked of them, and the eastern wall with its twice-repaired mortar visible through the windows, and the ring in her pocket that was going to go on the windowsill in the room that was hers. This was what the beginning of a thing looked like, not grand, not announced, just present and ordinary and alive. The days that followed were not without difficulty. She had not expected them to be. She had lived inside difficult things for long enough to know that yes did not remove difficulty, it only changed its shape. The difficulty that had come before her yes had been the difficulty of isolation, of being a person whose belonging somewhere was contingent on factors outside herself. The difficulty that came after her yes was the difficulty of actually belonging to something, which was a different kind of weight. She had to learn people. Not in the cataloging way she had learned them in the first week, the systematic inventory of who they were and how they operated, and what weight they carried in the compound's social structure. She had to learn them in the way you learned people you were actually going to live alongside indefinitely, which required you to be known in return, and being known was not something she had significant practice in. She was awkward about it sometimes. She said the wrong thing on 3 separate occasions in the first month, and had to go back and say different things afterward, which she found uncomfortable and necessary, and which she did without waiting for someone to indicate it was required, because it was required, and she knew it was required, and the waiting would have been its own kind of cowardice. She had not been inside a thing, she did not know the grammar of inside yet, she was learning it. The claiming bond was its own education. It was not what she had expected, which was either very present or very subtle, and it was both of those things and also something that had no analogy in her previous experience, something that operated in the body before the mind and that manifested not as a constant awareness, but as a quality of the air when she was in the same space as Kale or Dax, a quality she was slowly learning to stop cataloging and simply let be present. There were conversations with both of them that were, occasionally, genuinely difficult. Kale's directness sometimes landed harder than he intended, and she had to tell him when it did, which was a thing she had not previously had enough safety in a relationship to do. Dax's precision sometimes shaded into a kind of exactness that left no room for her to be imprecise, which she also had to name. They listened when she named things. They adjusted, not perfectly, not immediately, but actually, which was what mattered. She named things to them too when they needed to be named. She did this imperfectly and not always gracefully, and she was honest about the imperfection, which was something that both of them appeared to find not just acceptable but specifically valued, which she was still in the process of understanding. She learned the compound. She learned it the way you learned something you were going to be inside for a long time, which was differently from how you learned something you were passing through. She learned which stones on the path near the hall were uneven and needed to be watched in the morning when the ice reformed overnight. She learned that the fire in the main hall had to be started a specific way or it would smoke, and that Pete was one of the 3 people in the compound who knew the specific way and could teach it reliably. She learned that Soren kept the medical supplies in a particular order that she did not deviate from, and that deviating from it was the one thing that would cause Soren to be briefly and precisely sharp with you, which everyone had learned and respected. She learned Lena's workshop, because she went back every few days and sometimes watched and sometimes helped and sometimes simply sat while Lena worked, and the thread in Lena's hands over those weeks gradually resolved into something she could see was going to be a specific shape, though she could not yet tell what shape it would be when it was complete. She learned the eastern wall. Dax taught her the mortar work. He had found the right materials in the 3rd week after her arrival, the specific combination of materials that was correct for the temperature and the age of the stone and the weight the repair had to carry, and he had started the work on a section of the wall that was beginning to need attention. She worked alongside him, and he taught her with the same quality of precision he brought to everything else, naming what she was doing right and what she was doing wrong with equal specificity, and without making the wrong thing feel like more than a thing to correct. She learned the feel of the material under her hands, the way it went on and the way it set, the difference between the hurried application and the careful one, which was not just time but attention, the difference between putting something in a place and placing it there properly. She thought about Lena's thread and what it could hold and what you could build with it once you knew. She thought about this compound and what it was holding and what had been built here and what was still in the process of being built, and she thought about the founding records that said her choice above everything, and she thought about 300 years of a place that had written that law before they needed it, and then kept the records so it was available when the need arose. Kept the records carefully, the way you kept things you thought you might need. She was 4 months in when she went to the hall one morning and found that Pete had left the seat empty. She looked at it. She looked at Pete. He shrugged. You do not always need it saved for you, he said. You know where it is. She sat down. She thought, yes, I do know where it is. That was the morning she stopped thinking of it as the seat Pete saved for her and started thinking of it as her seat in the hall. Not because Pete had said anything to her about the change, because she had internalized it, the way she internalized things in places where she was actually present rather than passing through. The ring was on the windowsill. She had put it there that first morning and there it stayed, on the south side of the window where the light found it in the afternoons. She had looked at it on the second afternoon and thought, it looks right there, that was all. In the 6th month she asked Lena what the thread was becoming, and Lena showed her the partial shape of it, which was a large and intricate piece of work that had a structure she had not been able to see from the stages she had watched. Lena told her the name for it in the craft, the technical word for the specific kind of thing it was, and Myra learned the word and looked at the work and thought about the months of learning the material before the building could begin. She thought, I understand that now, not as a concept, as a thing I have done. In the 8th month she had an argument with Dax that was genuine and significant, and that lasted 3 days in its full form and another week in its residue. And at the end of it they were both clearer about something they had each been handling slightly wrong, and the clarity was uncomfortable and also genuinely useful, the way that the second repair of the eastern wall had been uncomfortable and also genuinely useful, because it was the work that needed doing and it was better to do it carefully. She told him this after. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said, that is exactly it. She went to Lena's workshop that afternoon and she sat on the bench and she said, I had a significant argument with Dax this week. Lena kept working. How did it resolve? Correctly, said Myra, which was not comfortably. No, said Lena, correct and comfortable are not the same category. I am learning that, said Myra. In the 10th month she stood at the eastern wall in the early morning, alone, before the compound was fully awake, and she put her hand on the stone and she breathed in the cold air that was the same cold it had been the morning she arrived, but was not the same cold at all, because she was not the same. She was not the same in ways she had not anticipated, and ways she had worked toward deliberately, and ways she could not fully describe yet because they were still happening, still resolving into the final shapes they would eventually take. She thought about the woman who had walked up to this gate with a borrowed coat and a ring she had not meant to bring, and the specific determination to adapt to whatever the place required her to adapt to. She thought about that woman with a kind of recognition that was not quite distance, because she was not far from her. She was simply further along. The ring was on the windowsill. The accounts were current. The seat in the hall was hers. The eastern wall held. A year from the day she arrived, Ada came to find her. Not in the hall at mid-morning, the usual time. Ada came to the stores where Myra was working, alone, in the middle of the afternoon. She came with the same certainty she always had, but also with something that looked, on Ada's 8-year-old face, like the deliberation of someone who had been thinking about something for a while. I remember when you arrived, Ada said. I know, said Myra, you asked if I was staying. I ask everyone, Ada said. But I remember you specifically because you said you did not know. Most people say yes or they say something about hoping or something about thinking so. You said you did not know. Myra set down the pen. Did you know that day? Ada asked. Did you actually not know or did you know and not say? Myra thought about this honestly. I actually did not know, she said. I had been here one morning, I had not seen enough. Ada considered this. And then you found out enough. Yes, said Myra. Ada looked at the shelf of supplies. The alphas are different since you came, she said. Myra waited. They were always good, Ada said, with the comfortable authority of a child who had been paying attention to the same people for her entire life. But they were also, she looked for the word, careful, like they were being careful not to break something. Myra thought about 11 years of building something and taking care of what they had built, the 3 weeks on the eastern wall, the careful second repair. They are less careful now, she said. They are more careful, Ada said. About you, about everything else they are less careful about being careful, if that makes sense. Myra thought about this. Yes, she said. That makes sense. Ada nodded. I just wanted to tell you, she said, because I thought you should know. She left. Myra stood in the stores and she thought about being 8 years old and deciding to tell someone the truth because you thought they should know, and she thought about the specific and uncomplicated bravery of that. She thought about being 22 years old and walking off an iron transport into a wind that hit her like a fist, in a borrowed coat, with a ring she had not meant to bring, not knowing what was on the other side of a gate that had no bell. She thought about everything that had been on the other side. She finished the afternoon's work. She walked to the hall. Pete was there already at the table, and he moved his cup to indicate the space across from him was available even though she had not needed the indication for months. She sat across from him. The grain was already out. The bad coffee was already made. Cale came in from the north corridor and sat at the end of the table. Dax came in from the kitchen and sat 2 seats from her and looked at the coffee pot and then at her, with the slight expression that meant he had something to say that was not urgent. The northern fence section needs attention, he said. This week or next week, she said. This week is better, he said, before the next cold comes down. Tomorrow morning, she said, I can do the morning. Good, he said. She poured him a cup of the bad coffee. He accepted it without ceremony. They drank the terrible coffee in the warm hall of the frozen pack, a year after she had come through the gate in the cold and sat down in the snow in front of it. And the hall was the same hall it had been then, and she was not the same person she had been then, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither of them was the whole story. The ring was on the windowsill in her room. Tomorrow she would fix the northern fence section. Tonight the fires would burn in the hall and the compound would settle into its night sounds, and she would lie in the room that was hers, and she would not count the exits because she had stopped needing to count them a long time ago, around the time the exits had stopped being the most important thing in the room. She finished her coffee. She looked around the hall. She thought, this is what staying looks like, not the moment of the yes, not the morning at the eastern wall, the morning a year later with the bad coffee and the ordinary company and the fence section that needed doing tomorrow and Pete talking about something she was about to pay attention to. The ordinary and continued and unremarkable fact of being somewhere that was yours. She leaned forward. She started listening to Pete. She had been in the compound for 2 weeks before she understood that the compound was not only watching her. She had assumed the watching was one-directional. She was the new element, the arrival, the person whose status and nature and intentions were unknown to the people who had been here before her. It was natural and logical that she would be observed, and she had been observing back as a matter of self-preservation, and she had understood this dynamic to be temporary, the temporary attention paid to anything new before it became familiar enough to stop requiring special attention. What she had not understood, until the 2-week mark, was that the compound was in the process of including her. Not as a project, not as a deliberate and conscious effort to make her feel welcome, as a natural consequence of her being present and doing the work that was available and sitting at the table in the morning and walking the paths in the afternoon. The compound was including her the way it included anyone who was genuinely in it, which was by adjusting to accommodate the fact of her, and then forgetting to make a distinction between the accommodation and the original. She noticed it first in the kitchen. She had been helping with the evening meal for 3 days by then, because Soren had one night said the kitchen could use another pair of hands, and she had said yes, and had been saying yes every evening since. On the 14th evening, she was cutting the root vegetables that went into the pot that fed the hall, and one of the other kitchen workers, a man named Graham who was perhaps 35, and who had a very specific and well-organized way of cutting that he did not deviate from, had said without looking up from his own board, "Cut them smaller. The heat in that pot is unreliable tonight and smaller pieces cook through better." She had cut them smaller. Graham had not explained his observation further. He had not apologized for offering it. He had offered it the way you offered information to a person who was working alongside you in a shared task, the way you offered information to someone whose competence you assumed and whose attention you trusted. He had included her in the kitchen's knowledge base, without announcing that he was doing it. She had stood at the cutting board after the meal was served, and she had thought, "He told me that the way he would have told Pete, not the way you told a newcomer, the way you told a person in the kitchen." She was a person in the kitchen. She had not known she was until she was. The thing was happening in other places too. She noticed it once she started noticing it, the way you notice the specific quality of air after it rains when you had been indoors for the rain and step out after. Prue in the stores, who had started saying your standard rather than the standard when she referenced the way Myra categorized the inventory, as if the categorization had become the location's own. Pete in the hall, who had started addressing things to her directly in the morning rather than directing them generally at the table, and then looking at her to see if she was tracking. Lena in the workshop, who had started teaching her not as a visitor watching the work, but as someone who was going to need to know how to do it. She was being built into the compound. She was not entirely sure when she had consented to this, or whether consent was the right word for it, or whether it was the kind of thing that did not require consent, because it was happening to both her and the compound simultaneously, each adjusting to the other in the small and unremarkable ways that living alongside something always involved. She thought about this on the evening of the 14th day, in her room, with the ring on the table and the lamp burning and the compound sounds coming through the window. She thought 2 weeks ago you arrived here understanding yourself to be an offering. That is what the council called you. That is the category they placed you in. An offering is not a person in a place, it is a transfer of something from one party to another. You are a person in this place. She sat with the distinction. It had not been granted to her. Nobody had said, "You are no longer an offering, you are now a person." The distinction had not been announced. It had just become true, gradually and without ceremony, through the accumulation of cutting board instructions and saved seats and accounts that someone called yours, through the specific and mundane process of actually being somewhere. She picked up the ring. She turned it in her fingers. She thought about her mother, who had been a person in a village the same way, who had been the accumulation of the things she did and the ways people had adjusted to her presence, and the knowledge they had developed about her in the specific and unremarkable terms of daily life. The ring had been part of that accumulation, the thing on her finger that you looked at and knew something about her from, the worn gold that said 30 years of being here, of being this. She set the ring down. She thought, you are becoming the accumulation of yourself in this place. That is what is happening. That is what has been happening since you sat down in the snow. She lay down and looked at the ceiling, and she let the compound sounds come through the window, the ordinary sounds of 40 people doing the ordinary things of an evening, and she let herself be part of it without examining the participation too closely. She slept. The compound had a particular quality in winter that was different from the autumn she had arrived in. She had not expected to be surprised by winter in a place called the Frozen Pack, but she was surprised because the winter was not what she had been prepared for. She had been prepared for severity, for the hard season, for the period when resources were rationed and the cold was the primary fact of life and the community pulled into itself and became smaller and more guarded. She had seen winter in the village work this way, the contraction of people into their own warmth, the careful attention to what remained and what had been used, and whether what remained would be enough. The Frozen Pack's winter was different. The cold came harder and it came more completely, and it was not to be underestimated. She learned this in the first hard week of it, when the temperature dropped to a depth that made the previous cold feel like an introduction. But the compound did not contract. It expanded in a particular way, the way things that have been built for a specific environment expand into the conditions they were built for. The fires grew larger. The hall became the center of things in a way it was not quite in the milder months, people gathering in it longer and more completely in the evenings, the conversations running later, the general temperature of company increasing as the temperature of the air outside fell. She had not anticipated this. She had thought winter would mean less, and it meant more. She had not anticipated enjoying it. She had not anticipated enjoying much about this place, in the specific and unguarded way of someone who had moved past the preliminary calculations and arrived at the genuine article. She was surprised repeatedly by the things she found herself caring about that had nothing to do with utility and everything to do with simply liking what she found. She liked the morning grain. She had liked it since the first morning but had been noting this as a data point rather than as a preference. Now she noted it as a preference. She liked the grain and the bad coffee and Pete's table conversations and Lena's workshop in the afternoon light and the sound of the compound settling into sleep at night. She liked the Eastern Wall, which she visited often enough now that it had stopped being a place she went to think and had become simply a place she went, the way people went to places that were theirs. She liked the mortar work. She had done 2 sections of the wall now, both with Dax, and she had learned enough to do a short section on her own on a Monday when the light was right, and the materials were ready and Dax was occupied with something else and she had simply started. She had done it carefully with the specific care that the material required, the care that was different from caution, the care of someone who understood the weight the seam had to carry and was doing the work that would let it carry it. When Dax had seen it later, he had stood and looked at it for a moment. "Good," he had said. She had looked at it beside him. "The grain here is slightly uneven," she had said, pointing to a section a foot from the right edge. "I noticed it after it set. I would have done it differently." "You will," he said, "next section." She had looked at him. "You are very comfortable with imperfection for someone so precise," she said. He had looked at the wall. "Imperfection that is seen and understood is not imperfection anymore," he said. "It is knowledge. The problem is imperfection that is not seen." She had thought about this for a long time. She thought about it now, on a winter evening in the hall, with the fire generous and the company full and Pete across from her working through an argument about the Northern Supply routing with someone who was taking his argument seriously and pushing back on it. And she thought about imperfection that was not seen and imperfection that was, and what the difference was. She thought she understood it better than she had when he said it. It had been imperfection that was not seen in the village, not in the compound sense of imperfection, not in the sense of a repair done slightly unevenly in one section. In the village, she had been a person who was known in categories and not in specifics, who was seen in the large and functional terms of what she was for and not in the small and particular terms of what she was. The imperfection of that arrangement was that she had been in it for 22 years, and nobody had seen it was imperfect. Here she was seen in the small and particular terms. The accounts she had organized were called her standard because they reflected something specific about how she thought. Graham called the vegetable cuts smaller in a way that included her in the kitchen's working knowledge. Cale looked up when she crossed the hall and the look said something specific about her, something that was her name rather than her category. She looked up when Cale crossed the hall too. She thought, "You have been here 3 months and you are not the same person who arrived. You were not supposed to be the same person who arrived. That was the point of it." She wondered what the woman who had arrived in the borrowed coat would have thought of her now, and she thought, she would not be surprised. She would have needed more information, but she would not have been surprised. She was always capable of this. She just had not been in a place that let her demonstrate it. She thought this with a kind of precision that was not quite pride, and was not quite grief, and was somewhere in between, which was its own kind of useful. The hall talked on around her. The fire was warm. She stayed in it. Cale was not always easy. She had known this early, in the way she knew things about people before she could have articulated the evidence. There was a quality to him that was like the Eastern Wall, solid and reliable and occasionally hard in the literal sense, the kind of hard that was not hostile but was simply weight, the weight of someone who had been carrying significant things for a long time and had the habit of it and did not always remember to put the weight down when the context changed. She ran into this quality specifically for the first time in the 4th month. She had been working on the accounts for the winter supply update, a task that was more complex than the standard quarterly accounts because it required anticipating usage rates over the hard months and adjusting the ordering accordingly. She had been doing it for 2 days and she had a system that she had not explained to anyone because explaining it had not yet become necessary. And Cale had come to the accounts room in the afternoon and looked at what she had done and said, very directly and without any particular heat, that the system was wrong. She had looked at the system. She had looked at him. She said, "The system is not wrong. It is different from the previous system." He had looked at her with the multi-layered expression that she had now learned to read more specifically, and the layer she could see was the layer that was certain it was right. "The winter usage projections in this section are calculated by the month prior," he said. "The month prior in autumn is not predictive of winter usage." "I know," she said. "I have used the average of the 3 hardest winter months from the past 4 years, cross-referenced against the current supply levels. It is more accurate for winter than the month prior calculation. He was quiet. She waited. I did not see that, he said. The notation system is mine, she said. It is not the one the compound has been using. I should have explained it when I started using it. Yes, he said, you should have. She looked at the accounts. I will annotate it, she said, so it is clear. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, you looked at it, and you assumed the existing system, and when the numbers did not match, you assumed the system was wrong rather than that the system had changed. That is the kind of assumption that leads to real problems. He was still. I'm not saying this to argue, she said. I am saying it because it is accurate, and because if we are going to work together in this compound for a very long time, which appears to be the current plan, it is useful for both of us to know where the assumptions live. A longer silence. Yes, he said. That is right. I will annotate, she said. If something does not make sense after the annotation, come back. He left. She annotated the system. She sat with the conversation afterward, and she thought about whether she had handled it well or badly. She decided she had handled it accurately, which was not always the same as well, but which was the best she could do with the information she had at the time, and which was, she thought, the honest second repair version of the situation rather than the hurried first one. He came back 2 days later. Not to the accounts room, to the eastern wall where she was doing the third section of the mortar work. He stood and watched her work for a moment. The notation is clear, he said. The system is better than the previous one. She did not look up from the mortar. Thank you. I wanted to tell you directly, he said, because I had been direct with you about what I thought was wrong. She stopped working and looked at him. That is the right practice, she said. He was looking at the mortar. You are getting better at this, he said. Yes, she said. Dax is a good teacher. Dax is very precise, he said. Yes, she said, that is what makes him a good teacher. She went back to the mortar. After a moment he said, so are you. She paused. Precise, he said. You are very precise. I did not always recognize it as precision early on because it does not look like mine. She thought about this. No, she said, mine is quieter. Yes, he said. I have been learning to hear it. She finished the section. They walked back through the compound together in the late afternoon, and she thought about the accounts room conversation and this one and the distance between them, which was less than 4 days and also considerable, and she thought, this is what they mean when they talk about building something, not the single decision or the single conversation, the accumulation of them. The way the mortar held not because of the skill in any single application, but because of the consistent and careful work across all of them. She thought about all of it on the walk back. She thought, you are inside something. You are no longer adjacent to it or calculating whether to enter it. You are inside it, and the inside looks like this, like the accounts conversation and the corrected assumption and the walk back in the cold, and the hall getting warm ahead of you. She went in. She sat at the table with Pete. She drank the bad coffee. She was home. Not the way home was a feeling that arrived all at once and announced itself. The way home was a fact that accumulated until the accumulation passed the threshold of undeniability. She did not know when she had crossed the threshold. She knew she was past it. The ring was on the windowsill. The eastern wall held. The accounts were annotated and the system was clear. She was here. She found the kit and the boy in the 6th month. She was walking the northern perimeter in the early morning, which was something she had started doing after the first hard snow made the northern path the most useful route between the hall and the workshop, and she found the kit in the gap between the old storage building and the wall. It was very small, half frozen, and she stood and looked at it for a long moment before picking it up. She did not immediately know what kind of animal it was. She learned this later from Pete, who identified it as a type of small animal indigenous to the territory and explained that the mothers sometimes had difficulty keeping track of young in the early winter snows. She carried it wrapped inside her coat to the hall. Graham was the one who knew what to do with it. Graham, who she had categorized as the precise cutter of root vegetables and the person who knew the fire's temperament, turned out to also be the person in the compound who had the most experience with injured or orphaned animals, and he set aside what he was doing and took the kit from her, and assessed it with the same focused efficiency he brought to the kitchen. "It will survive," he said. "It needs warmth and feeding every few hours for the first week." "Who does it?" she said. He looked at her. "Whoever found it," he said. This appeared to be policy. She kept it warm. The every few hours schedule for the first week meant she was doing it at night too, setting a quiet alarm in her internal clock, the one she had relied on since she stopped sleeping properly in unfamiliar places, and getting up in the dark of the room to feed the small thing that had been left in the snow. She found this, in a way she had not expected to find it, genuinely good to do. The specific and practical requirement of the animal did not ask her to feel any particular way about it. It only required that she show up at the right times and do the right things, and she was excellent at showing up at the right times and doing the right things. By the end of the first week, it had warmed considerably and was eating with something that looked like enthusiasm. She carried it to the hall on the 8th morning in her coat pocket, which was where it had taken to being most of the time, and it came out of the pocket when Pete offered it something from his breakfast bowl, and the entire hall stopped being focused on breakfast and became focused instead on the small animal on the table, and Myra sat in the middle of all of this with the specific feeling of having introduced something into a space and watching the space incorporate it. Ada was very interested in the kit. She came to see it every day with the authority of someone who has decided that something is their concern and has not asked permission for the decision. She brought it things. She asked Myra questions about it with the same directness she applied to all questions, and Myra answered them accurately and in terms an 8-year-old could use, which Ada appeared to find preferable to the terms adults usually used. The boy was connected to the kit, though not directly. He arrived in the compound 2 weeks after the kit, in the company of a woman who had come across 3 territories to find the pack, and he was 11 years old and very thin, and he looked at the gate the way Myra had looked at it, with the specific attention of someone who was cataloging exits. She saw this from across the yard when they came through. She did not go to them, that was Kale and Soren's thing to manage. She watched from a distance, and she thought about the borrowed coat, and the boots that were too large and the cold that had come up through the snow while she sat in front of the gate, and she thought about Pete saving the seat, and Soren leaving the warm water and the 3 blankets at the foot of the bed. She went to the kitchen and she said to Graham, "The boy is thin." Graham looked out the window. "Yes," he said. "What does he like, do you think?" she said. "I do not know him," said Graham. "What did you like at 11? That tasted like something important." Graham thought about this. "Sweet things," he said. "With warmth in them." She made the thing that Graham described from the supplies they had, something sweet with the warmth of spice in it, and she brought it to the room where the boy had been put, the same corridor as her own room, and she knocked at the door, and when it opened she handed it to him without ceremony or explanation and said, "This is for you. It is warm." He looked at her. He looked at the thing in his hands. He looked back at her. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She went back to the kitchen. She thought about the 3 blankets. She thought about the warm water in the basin. She thought about Soren saying there is time for everything else in the tone of someone who knew that right now what was needed was warmth. She had thought then that the 3 blankets were the compound at its best. She thought now that the 3 blankets were simply the compound, the ordinary practice of a place that organized itself around the principle that people needed warmth first and everything else after. She went to the hall for the evening meal. Pete was talking about the boy who was named Eli. "He is quiet," Pete said, "but not the scared kind of quiet, the thinking kind." "Yes," she said. "He looked at the yard the way you looked at things when you first arrived," Pete said. She looked at him. "You remember that?" "I remember everything," Pete said with complete seriousness. "I have a very good memory. Soren says it is occasionally inconvenient." She ate her grain. She thought about Eli in the room with the warm thing in his hands, looking at her and then at it and then back at her. She thought about what he was learning about this place in the first hours of being in it, and she thought about what she had learned in her first hours, and she thought about the 3 blankets, which were the first information about this place that had contradicted what she had been prepared for. She hoped someone had given Eli 3 blankets. She thought you could go and check. She did not go and check. because it was not her place to do that and Soren would have it handled, but she noticed the impulse and she thought about what the impulse meant. The impulse meant she was inside the compound's way of doing things now, not just observing it from the outside but participating in the principle of it, the principle that said people needed warmth first and everything else after. She was part of the everything else after now. She was part of the and what you did was. That was not nothing. She drank the bad coffee. She thought 6 months ago you arrived not knowing if any of this was real. You spent time finding out. This is what real looks like from the inside of it. This is the answer to the question you had when you came through the gate. She set down the cup. She thought good. In the 7th month, Kale asked her about her mother. They were at the eastern wall, early morning, the light coming over the top of it the way she had come to expect it to come. She had been doing another section of mortar work, and he had come to watch, which was something he had started doing occasionally, not to check the quality of the work, but because it was the kind of watching that was its own form of company. She was working and he was standing and the morning was quiet and she said, without looking up from the mortar, "Why did you come to the wall this morning?" "Because you were here," he said. She kept working. "That is a real answer," he said, "not a performative one." "I know," she said, "I believe you." He was quiet. "Do you miss anyone from the village?" he said. She thought about it. "No," she said. "There was a woman named Gret. I miss the idea of her. The specific form of it, which is that she was the person who told me the truth when the truth was difficult, and I have not needed that function from someone outside myself since arriving here because you and Dax fill it more thoroughly than she did." She paused. "That sounds colder than I mean it." "It sounds accurate," he said. "I mean it warmly," she said. "The accuracy is the warmth." He was quiet. "My mother," she said. He did not speak. He understood that she had something to say and that it did not need encouragement. She was practical, Myra said. She was not romantic about things. She said what she thought in the minimum number of words that would carry the thought, and then she stopped talking. She set the float down for a moment. "I was young when she got sick, not so young that I did not understand it, old enough to watch it happen and know what I was watching. She had the fever for 5 months, and in the 5th month she stopped being herself, and in the 6th month she died." She picked up the float. She kept working. "The last clear thing she said to me that I remember was, 'Take care of yourself when the time comes to take care of yourself.' She said it in the 2nd month when she was still herself. I think she knew the time was coming." Kale was quiet. "The time came," Myra said. "I have been taking care of myself since. It is what I know how to do." She pressed the mortar into the gap with the careful pressure that set it correctly. "What I did not know how to do was let someone else contribute to the taking care." She had not gotten to that part of the lesson before the fever took her. She stepped back. She looked at the section. "I am learning it here," she said, "the letting someone else contribute part." He came to stand beside her and look at the section. "It is not easy to learn," he said. "No," she said. "Is it easy to let someone in who is learning it?" "No," he said, "but worth it." She looked at the mortar. She thought about her mother's ring on the windowsill, in the light that found it in the afternoons. She thought about what her mother had said and what her mother had not gotten to say, and she thought, "You are finishing the lesson. You are doing the part she ran out of time to teach you." She thought she would be satisfied with this. She turned away from the wall. "Come and get breakfast," she said. "Yes," he said. They went back through the compound in the morning light, and the hall smelled of grain cooking and the bad coffee that was already made, and she thought, "This is taking care of yourself when the time comes. This is what it looks like. The eastern wall and the bad coffee and the person walking beside you who came to the wall because you were there." This. In the 8th month, she learned that Dax had been afraid. Not in the general sense, not in the way that reasonable people were afraid of reasonable things. In the specific sense, the sense that had a name and a period of time attached to it. She learned this because he told her, which was something he did not do easily, because Dax was the most precise and the most private person she had encountered in this compound, and precision and privacy often lived together in people who had learned that the inside of their minds was more orderly than most contexts that tried to contain them. He told her because she had told him something first. She had told him about being 12 years old and asking Gret what the village was being so careful about, and what Gret had said, and what it had felt like to carry that knowledge at 12 and at 15 and at 18 and at 22, the knowledge of being a category before a person in the minds of the people who were supposed to know you. She had told him this not because she was looking for a response, but because they were working together on a section of accounts that required sustained quiet attention, and the quiet had become the kind in which things sometimes came to the surface, and this was one of them. He had listened in the way he listened to everything, with the full and comprehensive attention that made being listened to by him feel different from most forms of being listened to. He was quiet for a long time after. Then he said, "After our father died, Cale and I disagreed about who should lead first. The disagreement was significant." She waited. "What I was actually afraid of," he said, "was not getting the role wrong. I was afraid that if I was the one who led first, I would do what my father did because the pattern was in me and I had been watching it for 18 years. She set down her pen. "My father was not cruel," he said. "He was not deliberately harmful. He was a man who made decisions about what this pack needed without ever asking the pack what it needed, because he did not believe the pack knew better than he did what it needed. He believed this sincerely and the pack suffered from it sincerely." A pause. "I watched him do this for 18 years. I absorbed his patterns. I knew I had absorbed them. I was afraid they would express themselves in the same ways." "Did they?" she said. "Some," he said. "Less than I feared, more than I wanted. I am still working on it." She looked at him. He looked at the accounts, with the slight distance that came over his face when he was thinking about something he did not normally look at directly. "The founding records," she said, "the law about the claiming." He looked at her. "Your father would not have put that law first," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said, "he would not have." "But you put it first," she said. "The moment you told me what was happening, you told me what the law said I was entitled to, not what you wanted, what the law said I was entitled to." He was quiet. "That is not the pattern," she said. He looked at the window, the gray winter light. "No," he said, "that is not the pattern." "You knew what the difference was," she said. "You had been watching it for 18 years, and you knew the difference between the pattern and the thing it was trying to do, and you chose the thing." He was quiet for so long that she thought he was not going to answer. "I was not sure I had," he said, "until you told me what I had done." She thought about this. She thought about the word carrier and the burning of the document, and what it felt like to have someone burn a word that had been used for you before you knew the word existed. She thought about what it meant to do a thing correctly when you were afraid you would not, and how sometimes the fear of doing the wrong thing was exactly what kept you from doing it. "You did," she said. He looked at her. "You did," she said again. "I am not saying it to reassure you. I am saying it because it is true, and you should know that it is true because it is relevant information about yourself." He was quiet. "You are very sure of that," he said. "I am very sure of most things I am sure of," she said. "I take a long time to reach certainty. Once I reach it, I am reliable about it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at the accounts. "The notation in this section," he said. "Should I be reading the third column as a comparison to the previous year or as an absolute figure?" "Comparison," she said. "The heading is not clear," he said. "You are right," she said. "I will change it." They went back to the accounts. The afternoon went on around them, the compound settling into its winter rhythms, the fires burning and the voices carrying through the walls and the cold sitting hard against the windows. She worked beside him and she thought about 18 years of watching a pattern and being afraid of it, and she thought about the difference between a thing you had learned and a thing you chose, and she thought, "This is the man who burned the word carrier because it had no right to be in the world. That was a choice." She changed the heading. The accounts were clear. She thought so is he. The 9th month brought a visitor from outside. She had not thought much about outside since arriving. Not because she had decided not to, but because the compound's internal life had been comprehensive enough to be the primary content of her days, and the outside had existed mainly in the form of the territory beyond the walls, which she could see from the wall's top on the days she was doing the mortar work. The visitor came through the main gate in the company of 3 pack members who had been working the outer boundary, and she saw them from the northern path and knew immediately that the visitor was not a new arrival in the way she had been a new arrival. They had the bearing of someone who was returning to context they had been in before, the ease of the known rather than the alertness of the unknown. She learned from Pete, who learned from everyone simultaneously, that the visitor was a council representative from the nearest organized territory, a man named Aldis who came twice a year and who was not, Pete said with careful precision, a problem, but who was not a problem either. She asked Pete what that meant. Pete said he is always very polite. He always does the thing he is supposed to do. He never does anything wrong. He also never asks about the compound from genuine curiosity. He asks about it the way someone asks who is building a catalog. She thought about this. She was helping in the stores when Cale came to find her. He stood in the doorway and she set down the pen and looked at him and waited. "There is a visitor," he said. "I know," she said. "Aldis." He looked at her. "You already know." "Pete," she said. He considered this. "He is going to ask about you," he said. "He knows you arrived. He knows the general terms of your situation. He is going to ask directly about what your status is now." She set the pen down completely. "What do you want me to tell him?" Cale said. She thought about this. She thought about what her status was in the language that an external council representative would use, and what it was in the language the compound actually used, and whether those 2 languages had a shared vocabulary. "Tell him I am a member of the pack," she said. "Not an offering, not a resource, a member." He looked at her. "That is what I am," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." "He may not like that answer," she said. "No," said Cale, "he will prefer the other vocabulary." "He can prefer it," she said. "That does not make it accurate." Cale looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as the thing she found most specific to him, which was the look of someone who had been doing a hard thing alone for a long time and was in the process of understanding that he was not doing it alone anymore. She had seen it several times. It was still something she had to be careful not to look at too directly, or it would require more from her than she was ready to give in public. "I will tell him," he said. "I know," she said. She went back to the stores and she finished the afternoon's work, and she did not think about Aldis, who had not done anything wrong and who was not a problem. She thought instead about what it meant to say, "I am a member," to claim the membership directly rather than allowing it to be assigned or assumed, to name it in the vocabulary that was accurate rather than the vocabulary that was convenient. She had said it to Cale. She had said it clearly. She thought, that is what you do now, you say the accurate thing. Aldis came and went. She passed him in the hall once, the next morning. He was a man of perhaps 50 with a thoughtful and organized face, and he looked at her with the specific quality of recognition that said he knew exactly who she was and had information about her that preceded this meeting. She looked back with the full and level attention she used on things she needed to see clearly. He nodded. She nodded. She went to her seat with Pete and ate her grain and did not think about what Aldis was cataloging and what he was writing in his report that would go back to whatever body he represented, and what that body would do with the information that the Frozen Pack's recent arrival was a member rather than an offering. She thought about it a little. She decided it was Cale and Dax's thing to manage, and she had confidence in their management of it, which was not the confidence of someone who had given up the responsibility of her own situation, but the confidence of someone who understood the division of labor in the place she was inside. She was the accounts and the stores and the eastern wall and the morning grain with Pete. She was the member. The management of external representatives who came twice a year was Cale and Dax's. She ate her grain. She went to the stores. She was good at what she did. The 10th month was when Lena finished the thread work. Myra came to the workshop on a Thursday morning and found Lena holding the completed piece up in the light from the middle window, turning it slowly, looking at it with the expression of someone assessing whether the thing in their hands had become what they intended it to become. It was large. It was intricate in a way that was specific rather than decorative, the intricacy serving the structure rather than ornamenting it. The colors that had been dark thread in the early months had developed into something that had depth to it, a depth you saw differently depending on how you held it in the light. Myra stood in the doorway. Lena lowered it. "Come and look," she said. Myra came and stood beside her and looked at the work in Lena's hands. She could see the structure of it clearly now. She could see where the early work had been, in the foundation layers, and where the later work had built on it, and where the two came together to create the quality of the finished piece, which was something that had accumulated into being more than the sum of what she had watched Lena do during the months of its making. "How long has it taken you?" she said. "Most of the year," Lena said. "The learning the material part was 4 months, the building was 6 months. Myra looked at it. "What will you do with it?" she said. Lena turned it once more in the light. "I will give it to someone," she said. "Who?" Lena looked at her. "I am thinking about it," she said. Myra looked at the work. She thought about 4 months of learning what a material could hold before you started to build. She thought about 6 months of building once you knew. She thought about the thing in Lena's hands that had started as thread in several colors that she had not been able to see the shape of, and that was now a specific and complete thing with its own weight and structure and depth. She thought about 10 months in the frozen pack. She thought about the person who had arrived in the borrowed coat and the person she was now, and the distance between them, which was not a distance exactly but more like a depth, the way the thread work had depth, the way you saw it differently depending on how you held it in the light. "Lena," she said. Lena looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for the first conversation, for what you said about learning the material before you build." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Did it help?" "It helped very much," said Myra. "I have been saying it to myself at regular intervals for 10 months. Lena looked at the work in her hands. "My teacher said it to me in my 2nd year," she said. "I have been saying it to people who arrive since. The ones who seem like they need it." "Did you think I needed it?" "Yes," said Lena, "but not in the way most people need it. Most people need it to be told that they are allowed to go slowly. You needed it to be told that going slowly on purpose was different from not being able to go." Myra thought about this. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly the distinction." She left the workshop, and she walked back through the compound in the October cold, which was different from the September cold and the August cold, settling in toward the deep cold of full winter with the specific and steady inevitability of seasons in a place that took its seasons seriously. The compound was preparing for winter in the ways she now recognized, the extra wood being brought in, the stores being checked and supplemented, the winter schedule of the fires beginning to take shape. She was part of the preparation. She had been assigned a section of the winter supply accounting because she knew the system and because the accounting needed doing and she was the person who did it well. She would do it this week, alongside the regular work, and it would be done correctly and the compound would be ready for the hard months. She was part of the compound being ready for the hard months. She thought about this as she walked. She thought this is belonging, not the feeling of it which you could have without the fact of it. The fact of being the person who does the accounting and who is relied on for the accounting and who will be doing the accounting in the winter months and the spring months and the years that follow them. The fact of being known specifically, in the way that the people who lived beside you long enough to adjust to you and be adjusted to know you, in the small and exact and unremarkable terms of daily life. She was known here. She was a member. She went to the hall. Pete was there. The seat was empty across from him. She sat in it. She thought, this is what happened when you sat in the snow in front of a gate that had no bell and waited. This is the other side of the gate. This is what the other side of the gate looked like from the inside, from 10 months in, from the perspective of someone who had gone slowly on purpose, and had learned what the material could hold before she started building. It looked like this. The grain and the bad coffee and Pete's morning conversation, and the fires building up in the hall, and the compound waking up around her into its full and ordinary and specific life. It looked like exactly this. She picked up her spoon. She began. A year after the day she arrived, she went to the gate. Not to leave, she went to look at it, because the year mark was the kind of marker that made you want to see the beginning, to look at the point where something started from the perspective of someone who knew what had started there. She stood in front of the gate in the early morning before the compound was awake, in the coat that was hers now, that had been hers since Soren had said in the 3rd month, "You have been wearing that borrowed thing long enough," and had appeared the next morning with a coat that was the right size and the right weight, and that had been made for this cold, for this specific territory. The gate was the same gate. She looked at it. She thought about the woman who had stood in front of it a year ago, in a borrowed coat in boots that were too large, with a ring she had not meant to bring and a letter she was not allowed to open, and the specific quality of what that woman had felt, which was not fear and was not nothing, which was the state of someone who had stopped expecting anything and had arrived in the particular flatness of that state. She thought about the 2 men who had come through the gate and stood over her sitting in the snow, and the expression on the first man's face that was doing several things at once, and the low sound from the second man in the trees that was adjacent to a laugh. She put her hand on the gate. The iron was cold. The same cold it had always been and would always be, the cold of iron in winter, the cold of something that had been here long before she arrived and would be here long after. But she was on the inside of it now. She was on the inside looking out at the clearing and the trees and the narrow strip of the path that led to the boundary marker and the open ground beyond it. And the world out there was the world she had come from, the transport and the village and the council with their formal letter and the borrowed coat and the boots that were the wrong size. She was on the inside. She took her hand off the gate. She turned back toward the compound. Cale was standing on the path behind her. He had not made a sound, she had not heard him coming. She was not, she noticed, startled. She had been on the inside of this place long enough that his presence appearing behind her in the early morning felt simply like the right distribution of people in a space. "Come for breakfast," he said. "Yes," she said. They walked back through the compound together, in the morning that was just beginning to be light, in the cold that was the specific cold of this place, and that she had worn for a year now, until it was as familiar as anything she had ever worn. The hall was warm ahead of them. The fires were building up. She could smell the grain cooking. She thought, you came through a gate a year ago, and you sat in the snow because standing was a waste of energy, and what is on the other side of the gate is this. The morning and the warmth and the man walking beside you, and the seat that is yours, and the work that is yours, and the ring on the windowsill in the light, and the wall with its careful mortar, and the bad coffee that you have developed a specific and unremarkable affection for. This is what you stayed for. This is what staying is. She went in. She sat down. She began the 2nd year. There was a night in the 1st week when she could not sleep. She had been sleeping better since arriving than she had slept in years, which was its own kind of information, the body making decisions that the mind was still working out, the body saying rest here while the mind was still compiling. But on the 5th night she lay in the dark and the quiet and the warmth, and she was awake with all the specificity of someone who had something to be awake about. She lay still and she let the wakefulness have its say. What it wanted to say was this: you have come a very long way and you are in an unfamiliar place, and the situation you are in does not fit the shape of the situation you were prepared for, and those two things do not simply cancel each other out. The relief is real and the strangeness is also real, and both can be true. She lay in the dark and she acknowledged that both were true. She thought about the village, which she had left, and from which she had not been permitted to take any of the practical things and only the impractical ring, and she thought about the 5 years before the leaving and the specific and daily texture of those 5 years, the girl she had been at 12 when she learned what she was, and the woman she had been at 22 when she left, and the accumulation of years between those 2 points that had been mostly the experience of knowing what you were and adjusting your expectations accordingly. She thought about adjusting expectations. She thought about the 3 blankets. She thought you adjusted your expectations for 22 years to fit a place that saw you as a function, and you have been here 5 days, and the adjustment is not finished. The adjustment is going to take time, because you are not just adjusting to a new place, you are adjusting to the possibility that the adjustment you have been making your whole life was an adjustment to something that was wrong about you rather than true about you. She lay very still with this. She thought that is a large thing to adjust to. She thought you have time. She thought about Soren saying there is time for everything else, and she thought that Soren had been saying something specific with that phrase, something that she had not fully heard at the time because she had been too cold and too tired and too concentrated on the 3 blankets. She was hearing it now in the dark of the 5th night, with the quiet of the compound around her and the warmth of the room reliable and steady. There is time, not as consolation, as fact. There is time for all of this to become what it is going to become. There is time for the adjustment to finish. There is time for the strangeness to become the familiar, and for the relief to become the ordinary, and for the careful and cautious attention you're bringing to everything to gradually become unnecessary, not because the attention was wrong, but because the thing it was protecting you from is not what you thought it was. She breathed. She lay in the warmth. She let the wakefulness finish what it had to say. When it was done, she pulled the blankets more firmly over herself, 2 of the 3, and she lay in the dark, and she thought about the ice crystals she had seen on the borrowed coat's sleeve during the walk from the boundary marker, the small, precise ones that had been shaped like stars. They had melted when she entered the trees. She wondered if she would see them again sometime, on a walk outside the walls when the cold was right for them. She thought, probably, the cold here was right for that kind of thing. She thought, you will go for that walk. You will say them. You will know by then where you are going back to. She fell asleep with that thought, the specific and small thought of the ice crystals that had been stars, and the knowing where you were going back to, and she slept without dreaming until the morning arrived with its usual orderly layers, and she rose with the light and she put on the borrowed coat and she went to the hall. She went to the seat Pete had saved. She ate the grain. She drank the terrible coffee. She let the compound be what it was around her, alive and ordinary and specific, 40 people doing the 40 things they did every morning, and she sat in the middle of all of it and she breathed. This was the beginning of things. It did not feel like the beginning exactly. It felt like what the inside of a beginning felt like, which was not the dramatic version but the real one. It felt like grain and company and the warmth of a hall that had been burning its fires all night. It felt like exactly this. She finished her coffee. She said good morning to Pete. She was ready for the day. The walk outside the walls happened in the 11th month. Cale proposed it on a morning that was cold but clear in the way that winter mornings in the compound sometimes were, the sky a hard and specific blue that only appeared when the temperature dropped below a certain point, and the air had no moisture left to cloud it. She had been watching that sky through the hall's windows during breakfast and thinking about the ice crystals on the borrowed coat's sleeve, the thought she had been carrying since the 5th night, the thought about knowing where you were going back to. She said yes before he had finished asking. They went through the main gate, which opened for her now the way it opened for everyone who lived here, without ceremony and without the specific quality of observation she had felt when she had first come through it in the other direction. She walked through it, and the territory beyond received her as the territory had received her in both directions before, with the same cold and the same silence and the same absence of particular interest in who she was. Except that she was different in it this time. She was different in it the way you were different in a space, once you had somewhere to return to from it. The open territory had been the whole world when she had walked through it arriving, and now it was the space outside, and outside was defined by the fact of inside, and inside was the compound behind the gate she had just come through. She walked beside Cale, and she looked at the trees and the ground and the sky that was the specific cold blue she had been watching through the window, and she breathed the air that was as cold as the air had been on the day she arrived, and that felt different in the specific way that air felt different when you were breathing it temporarily instead of as a fact of your existence. They walked for an hour. She did not count the time exactly. She marked it in the way she marked things in this place, by the quality of the light and the specific sounds of the territory rather than by any precise internal accounting. She had been doing this for a while, trading the precise accounting for the less measurable but more present way of tracking time, and she found it suited the compound, suited the life she was living in it, in a way that the precise accounting had not. At some point she stopped. She stopped because there was something on the left sleeve of the coat that had not been there when they came out, and she looked at it, and it was ice crystals. Small ones, precise, shaped, she saw with the same detached and pleased attention she had brought to them on the first day, like very small stars. She stood and looked at them. Cale stopped beside her. He looked at what she was looking at. The air is exactly right for those, he said. The temperature and the moisture have to be specific. Yes, she said, I saw them when I arrived on the borrowed coat. She looked at the crystals. They melted when I came into the trees. He was quiet. I thought about seeing them again, she said, for a long time. She did not look away from them. They were precise and temporary and exactly as she had remembered them, shaped like small and specific stars, the kind of thing that existed only in the particular combination of conditions that produced it, and that was gone the moment those conditions changed. She thought about what it meant that she had thought about these and they had been here all along, in the territory outside the wall, waiting for the right day and the right coat and the right conditions, the same way the territory had been here all along, and she had been inside the wall and the two facts had not cancelled each other out, but had simply been simultaneously true. She turned and looked at the direction of the compound. She could not see the wall from here. They had walked far enough that the trees were between her and it, but she knew where it was. She knew the direction of it and the distance and what she would find when she walked back through the gate. She knew where she was going back to. All right, she said. She turned back toward the compound. They walked. The crystals stayed on her sleeve for 10 minutes more and then began to melt as they came back toward the tree line, and she watched them go with the same detached attention she had watched them with when she had first seen them, and she thought, yes, you knew that would happen, and yes, it is still worth it to have seen them, and yes, you are going back now, and yes, going back is the point. She came through the gate. The compound received her. She went to find Pete and she told him about the crystals, and Pete was genuinely interested in a way that was characteristic of him, the open and unperformative interest in the specific details of things, and she told him about the conditions required and what they looked like and how long they lasted, and Pete said, I have never seen those on purpose, I have only seen them by accident, and she said, I will take you, and he said, yes, and neither of them said when, but both of them understood that it would happen. This was another kind of belonging, she thought, not the large kind, the kind that was made of the small specific promises that both people intended to keep because they were both going to be here to keep them. She was going to be here. She thought this simply, without the careful layering of qualification she had surrounded it with before. She was going to be here. This was where she was. She went to the stores. She did the afternoon accounts. She did them in her system, the one with the annotation that made it clear, the one that was her standard now and that the compound had adopted as the standard, and that Prue had once said was more accurate than the previous system, and had said it directly, the way things were said here. She finished. She put the accounts away. She went to the hall for the evening meal. In the 12th month, there was a night that was the coldest night of the winter. She knew it was the coldest night because Soren had said during the day, in the tone she used for facts that required action, tonight will be the deep cold, make sure the fires are fully fed before dark, and do not let them go below half through the night. The compound responded to this the way it responded to things that required collective attention, which was with the quiet efficiency of a community that had done this before and knew how. She helped with the wood from the stores, carrying it in from the outer building in 2 trips, and she helped with the fires in the hall, learning from Graham how to build them for the maximum sustained heat rather than the maximum initial flame, and she sat in the hall after dinner with the rest of the compound, because on the deep cold nights everyone stayed in the hall, the warmth shared, and the fires maintained through the night by the rotation she had been added to. It was her rotation at midnight. She woke for it automatically, the internal clock she had relied on for years still reliable, and she came to the hall in the deep quiet of the compound's sleeping hours, and she found the fire and she fed it, and she sat with it for her portion of the night. It was the most quiet the hall had ever been. She sat in the quiet, and she watched the fire and she thought about the year and the passage of it, the accumulation of mornings and evenings and afternoons, and the specific and unremarkable texture of each of them, the growing weight of the days that were hers in this place. She thought about the ring on the windowsill and the bad coffee and Pete and Ada and Lena's thread work and the boy Eli, who was 3 months in now and who had stopped cataloging the exits, which she knew because Pete had told her and Pete knew everything. She thought about Cale at the eastern wall with his hand flat on the stone, and the morning light coming over the top of it. She thought about Dax saying the word carrier had no right to exist in the world, and the ash in the iron grate where the world of it had gone. She sat with all of this in the quiet of the hall at midnight, with the deep cold pressing against the walls and the fire fed and steady, and doing what it was meant to do. She thought you came from a village where you were a category, to a gate that had no bell, to a gate that had no bell, to a room with 3 blankets, to the inside of a year, to the inside of a life. She thought this is the inside of a life. Not the version she had been given, the version she had arrived at, the version that was accumulating every day in the specific and unremarkable and non-dramatic form of actual living. She sat with the fire until the next person came to take the rotation. She went back to her room. She looked at the ring on the windowsill. The light was not the afternoon light that found it best, it was the dark of very late at night, but she could see the shape of it in the dark, the round of it, the worn gold. She put her hand over it without picking it up. She thought about 30 years of a hand turning a ring and what that meant, the weight of 30 years in a specific place, the weight of someone who had been so completely in a life that the thing on their hand had worn thin with it. She thought, you are starting that. Not starting the 30 years, starting the accumulation of days that would eventually be 30 years. Starting the ordinary and unremarkable presence in a place that was hers, that was shaping itself around her as she shaped herself around it, the mutual adjustment that was the actual substance of belonging. She took her hand away from the ring. She lay down. She pulled 2 of the 3 blankets over herself. The fire in the hall was fed and steady and doing its work. The compound was sleeping around her. The cold outside was the deep cold, the coldest night of the winter, the kind of cold that required collective effort to manage, and that the compound managed collectively because it had been doing so for 300 years and had learned how. She was inside the collective effort now. She was inside the 300 years of it. She lay in the dark and she breathed and she let that be true, the large and specific truth of it, the truth of being inside something that was old and had lasted, and that had written the law she needed before it needed it, and had kept the records and had repaired the wall twice, and the second time more carefully. She was inside it. She breathed. She slept. In the morning when she went to the hall, Dax was already there, which was unusual. He was rarely the first to the hall, and he was looking out the window at the compound in the thin early light, and the coffee was already made and waiting. She came in. He turned. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. She poured 2 cups of the bad coffee. She handed him one. He accepted it. They stood at the window together and looked out at the compound in the thin cold light of the deep cold morning after the deep cold night, the fire's smoke rising straight up in the still air, the paths empty still, the compound not yet fully awake. She thought, this is the beginning of the 2nd year. She thought, this is what the 2nd year looks like from its first morning. She thought, it looks like this. The bad coffee and the window and the compound coming awake in the cold, and the man beside her who burned a word that had no right to be in the world, and who showed her the law that put her choice first, and who was precise in a way that was not coldness but was exactness, the exactness of someone who cared enough about getting it right to get it right. She drank the terrible coffee. It was warm. It was enough. Cale came in from the corridor, already dressed, already alert in the way he was alert before the rest of the compound was ready to be alert. He looked at the 2 of them at the window. He came and stood on her other side. She stood between them. She looked out at the compound waking up into another day, the smoke and the cold and the paths beginning to show the first footprints of the morning, and she thought, 3 of you at a window in the early morning, 3 of you looking at the same thing. This is also what the 2nd year looks like from its first morning. This is what you chose. This is what you are inside. She turned away from the window. She went to her seat. Pete arrived shortly after, bundled against the morning cold, and he sat across from her with the easy familiarity of someone who has sat across from the same person enough times that the sitting is its own comfortable fact, and he pushed the grain in her direction without being asked, and she accepted it without ceremony, and the hall filled around them in the ordinary and morning way of halls that had been doing this for a very long time. She ate her grain. She drank the terrible coffee. She let the 2nd year begin.